What becomes remarkable as we trace the lives of the Cadbury family and their distant cousins in the Rowntree name is not simply that they built vast fortunes from chocolate, though they most certainly did, but that they did so while clinging to something their religion taught them must be inseparable from business itself: conscience. How does a manufacturer, in an age of brutal competition and cutthroat capitalism, maintain ethical principles? How do Quaker values survive the pressure of industrial growth? And perhaps most intriguingly, what happens when two families, bound by faith, blood, and chocolate, begin to diverge in their visions of what an empire should be? If the story of British chocolate interests you, and particularly the quiet revolution that happens when religious conviction meets commercial ambition, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We gather these long-form histories specifically for the night, for the slow hours when your mind can wander through the corridors of the past without rush or demand. The Cadbury and Rowntree dynasties offer something richer than mere business history. They offer a meditation on values, on family, on the strange alchemy of turning beans into legacy. But let us begin where John Cadbury's own story begins, in the quieter world of the late 18th century, before chocolate became the mass commodity that would reshape his descendants' lives. John Cadbury was born in 1801 into a Quaker merchant family that had already established itself in the textile trade. The Religious Society of Friends, as Quakers formally call themselves, had by this time developed a distinctive relationship with commerce and manufacture. Where other Christian denominations had sometimes viewed business with suspicion, Quakers had come to see honest work and fair dealing as expressions of faith itself. They could not swear oaths in court, could not participate in warfare, could not engage in slavery, all of which narrowed their options in certain respectable professions. But they could trade, they could build, they could innovate, and they did so with a conscientiousness that, over generations, earned them a particular reputation for trustworthiness and integrity. The Cadbury family had been Quakers for several generations by John's time. His father, Richard Cadbury, was a prosperous merchant, and John grew up in an atmosphere of quiet religious conviction combined with commercial acumen. Yet John himself felt drawn not to the textile business that had enriched his family, but to something altogether different. The chocolate trade was then still a novelty in England, a luxury associated with exotic lands and the very wealthy. Chocolate was expensive, often adulterated with flour and fat to stretch supplies, and consumed primarily as a beverage by those who could afford the indulgence. Most chocolate drunk in England during John Cadbury's youth had been imported from the continent, or produced in tiny quantities by apothecaries and grocers who ground the beans in small batches by hand. What John Cadbury seems to have recognized, standing in his shop in the 1820s, was that this could change. The Industrial Revolution was transforming manufacturing across Britain. New machinery was being invented constantly, new methods of production emerging almost weekly. Why should chocolate remain a luxury? Why should it not, like cotton and pottery and iron, become something that could be produced efficiently, affordably, and distributed widely? His first years in the chocolate business were modest. He imported cocoa beans and sold them loose, alongside other goods: tea, coffee, sugar, the stock of any grocer of the period. But gradually, he began to experiment with production. He acquired or developed equipment to roast and grind cocoa beans with greater efficiency. By the 1830s, he was beginning to produce his own chocolate preparations, which he advertised in the local press with quiet pride. The quality was superior to much that was imported. The price, he believed, could be lower. Here was a business opportunity married to a kind of service, making a product that had been the preserve of the rich, available to ordinary working people. For a Quaker, imbued with the belief that honest dealing and the improvement of others' condition were moral goods, this must have felt like more than commerce. It felt like calling. What neither John Cadbury nor anyone else in 1824 could have predicted was the extent to which this small venture would grow, nor how profoundly it would reshape not only his family's fortune, but the very landscape of British industrial life. The chocolate business would eventually come to define the Cadbury name entirely. It would lead to innovations in manufacturing, in worker welfare, in family dynamics, and in the strange, delicate balance between maintaining principles and expanding power. But before we trace that expansion, before we move forward into the 19th century proper and watch as John Cadbury's small shop transforms into something vastly larger, it might be worth pausing here to notice something important about the moment in which John made his choice. The early 1820s were years of uncertainty in England. The Napoleonic Wars had only recently ended. The Industrial Revolution was accelerating, creating both tremendous wealth and tremendous social disruption. Traditional structures were breaking down. New forms of organization were emerging. It was a time when individuals with clarity of vision and some capital could genuinely reshape their world. John Cadbury possessed both, but he possessed something else too, a framework of values that was explicitly non-negotiable. He was a Quaker, not as a casual identity, but as a deeply held commitment. This would prove to be the defining tension of his life and of his descendants' lives, the question of how to grow, how to expand, how to engage in the logic of capitalism, while remaining true to the quieter values of conscience and care that had drawn his family to the Society of Friends in the first place. That question, unresolved in his own lifetime, would echo through generations. It would shape the buildings his children built, the way they treated their workers, the choices they made about expansion and competition, and the pursuit of wealth itself. For now, though, let us simply sit with the image of John Cadbury, in his shop on Bull Street, testing a new batch of chocolate on his own tongue, tasting the bitterness and the possibility, and wondering, perhaps, what this small endeavour might become. The story truly begins in Birmingham, England, in the year 1824, when a man named John Cadbury decided to open a small grocery shop on Bull Street in the heart of the city. He was not yet a chocolate maker, you understand. He was a merchant, a grocer who imported tea and coffee and spices from distant lands, and among those imports were cacao beans, those precious fermented pods that would eventually transform his family's fortune and reshape the landscape of British commerce. But this was not yet his grand vision. He was simply a young man, educated in the ways of trade, stepping into a world of commerce that was itself transforming beneath the rapid wheels of the Industrial Revolution. John Cadbury came from a Quaker family, and this detail, perhaps more than any other, would shape not only his business, but his entire moral vision. The Society of Friends, as Quakers called themselves, held beliefs that were rather unusual for their time. They believed in the inner light, a divine spark that existed within every human being. They rejected elaborate ceremony and hierarchy. They refused to swear oaths because they believed one should always speak truthfully. And crucially, many Quakers held deep convictions about the abolition of slavery and about the ethical treatment of workers. These were not merely spiritual principles tucked away in the meeting house on Sunday. They were meant to infuse every aspect of daily life, including how one conducted business. In 1828, as John Cadbury's grocery business began to flourish, he noticed something remarkable happening in Dutch warehouses and in the chocolate preparations of the continent. Cacao, once a luxury of the Spanish court and the wealthy elite, was beginning to be democratized. The Dutch had invented a cocoa press, a mechanical device that could separate the cocoa butter from the cacao solids, making chocolate far easier to work with, far less bitter, far more palatable to ordinary mouths. This was a turning point, though John Cadbury may not have fully grasped it in that moment. A product that had been confined to the luxury markets of Europe might now become something accessible to the working people of Britain. He began to experiment, to blend and roast cacao beans, and he started advertising his chocolate products not as exotic medicines or indulgences for the wealthy, but as a product for the common person. His approach was remarkably modern in its thinking, though grounded in an older sensibility, the Quaker belief that quality should be available to all, not hoarded by the privileged. What did it mean, after all, if you truly believed in equality and justice, if you then created products only the rich could afford? This tension, this desire to reconcile principle with profit, would become the central theme running through the Cadbury story, and, later, through the Rowntree narrative as well. By the 1830s, John Cadbury's chocolate business was growing, though it remained a modest operation compared to what would come later. He was experimenting with different types of chocolate, drinking chocolates, cocoa powders, and early forms of solid chocolate confectionery. But he was hampered by the limitations of his time. The equipment was crude by modern standards. The supply chains were uncertain, and there was a significant problem that would plague the entire chocolate industry until the middle of the century: the British government's punitive taxation on cacao imports. Sugar carried duties, cacao carried duties. The government seemed determined to ensure that chocolate remained a luxury item, taxed at rates that made it almost impossible for ordinary workers to purchase it without significant sacrifice. The Quaker philosophy, however, extended beyond the desire to make products accessible. It also encompassed a vision of how workers should be treated, how factories should be organized, and what kind of society could be built through ethical commerce. John Cadbury and his family were not utopian dreamers in the romantic sense. They were practical business people, but they were motivated by something beyond the mere accumulation of wealth. This distinction is crucial because it explains why, as their empire grew, they invested so heavily in the welfare of their employees and the communities around them. They were not performing philanthropy as a public relations exercise, as some wealthy industrialists might do. They were attempting, as imperfectly as any human effort can be, to live out their beliefs. As John Cadbury moved through middle age, watching the Industrial Revolution reshape Birmingham and the Midlands, he carried with him a vision of what commerce could be when guided by conscience. His sons, Richard and Benjamin, watched their father build this business with intelligence and moral clarity, and when they came of age, they would inherit not just a successful company, but a profound sense of responsibility. The question that hung over their generation was whether this vision could scale, whether it could survive the pressures of massive industrial growth, whether you could remain a Quaker in spirit while becoming one of Britain's largest manufacturers. That struggle, played out across generations and decades, would define the Cadbury dynasty and eventually lead to one of the most remarkable industrial communities ever created in Britain or anywhere else. The Cadbury family's story truly began not in Birmingham, but in the quieter reaches of the Quaker movement itself. John Cadbury, born in 1801, came of age in a Britain that was only just learning what chocolate could be. His parents were devout Friends, that's what Quakers called themselves, and the faith shaped everything. The Quaker commitment to honest dealing, to craftsmanship without vanity, to profit without exploitation. These weren't merely spiritual ideals to be spoken of on Sunday and forgotten by Monday. They were embedded in how business was conducted, in the very grain of daily practice. You see, in those early 1800s, chocolate was not the confection we know today. It arrived in England as a luxury powder, imported from the Caribbean and Central America, bitter and demanding preparation. The wealthy took it as a drink, mixed with hot water or milk, a stimulant and a status symbol all at once. But it was also often adulterated, mixed with flour, with brick dust, with substances no one wished to name. The industry was largely unregulated, and purity was something hoped for rather than guaranteed. John Cadbury, standing in this landscape, saw an opportunity that aligned with his conscience. He could import cocoa beans, roast them carefully, grind them with integrity, and sell something genuine to people who deserved better. In 1824, he opened a small shop in Bull Street, Birmingham. The shop itself was modest, but the work behind it was meticulous. He sourced his cocoa directly, built relationships with suppliers, and refused to cut corners for the sake of margin. Other confectioners and grocers scoffed a little. There was money to be made in cutting corners after all. But Cadbury believed, with the quiet persistence that Quakerism cultivates, that honesty would outlast deception. He would purchase the cocoa, roast it in small batches, grind it between millstones, and package it in paper stamped with his name and the promise of purity. That promise mattered. In an age when food safety was a genuine lottery, a merchant's word was sometimes the only assurance a customer possessed. His business grew steadily, not explosively, but with the kind of organic expansion that comes from reputation spreading mouth to mouth. By the 1840s, John's two sons, Richard and George, were old enough to join the enterprise, and it was George Cadbury, who would transform the family operation into something far larger and far more visionary than even his father had imagined. But before we follow George into that next chapter, it's worth pausing to understand what the Quaker background really meant, for how these men approached their work. Quakers had long been associated with commerce and craftsmanship. They believed in the spiritual dignity of honest labor. They also believed in temperance, in moderation, in steering clear of the excesses that characterized much Victorian business life. Bribing officials, adulterating products, squeezing workers until they broke. These weren't just poor business practices to a Quaker, they were spiritual failures. A man who built his fortune on deception was building it on sand. And so there emerged among Quaker industrialists a particular breed of businessman, someone who could be ruthlessly efficient in production and distribution, who could innovate boldly and expand aggressively, yet who carried alongside that ambition a genuine concern for the welfare of those around him. It's a paradox that many business histories struggle to hold, yet it was absolutely central to how the Cadbury family understood their role. The chocolate they made was good chocolate, made with genuine cocoa, and they advertised this fact relentlessly. As the Victorian era progressed and industrialization deepened, chocolate became less of an exotic luxury and more of a commodity that ordinary people could afford. The Cadbury family didn't simply ride this wave, they helped create it. They invested in mechanization, in factories designed not as dark satanic mills, but as clean, orderly spaces where workers could take pride in their craft. They developed new products, cocoa essence, drinking chocolate, and eventually the confections that would make the name Cadbury synonymous with chocolate itself. Now, across England, a parallel story was unfolding. In York, a market town in Yorkshire that felt almost rural in comparison to industrial Birmingham, the Rowntree family was embarking on a very similar journey. The Rowntrees were also Quakers. Henry Isaac Rowntree had established a cocoa business in York in the 1860s, and it was his son Joseph Rowntree Jr., who would build it into something remarkable. Joseph inherited a small, struggling concern and saw, as John Cadbury had seen decades earlier, that there was integrity to be made profitable. He insisted on purity. He invested in technology. He believed that the workers who created his products deserved respect and fair wages and safe conditions. The early years of both enterprises, Cadbury and Rowntree, were marked by a kind of ethical experimentation. These were not men content to simply replicate what their competitors were doing. They wanted to prove that a business could be profitable and moral simultaneously, that growth and conscience could travel together. This belief would eventually manifest itself in ways that went far beyond the factory floor. It would reshape how they thought about their responsibility to the towns where they operated, the workers who depended on them, and the very meaning of industrial life in an age of rapid, often brutal change. But that story, the story of those grand, visionary gestures, unfolds more fully as we move deeper into the lives of George Cadbury and Joseph Rowntree, the men who would truly make the chocolate dynasties what history remembers. The transformation that began in Birmingham found its fullest expression not in factory machinery alone, but in the deeply held beliefs of the Cadbury family themselves. John Cadbury, you see, had been a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends, and this faith would prove to be far more than a personal conviction. It would become the architectural blueprint for how his sons, Richard and George, would build their empire. The Quaker faith emphasized honesty, simplicity, and a profound responsibility to the welfare of one's workers. These were not merely nice sentiments to be written on a plaque and forgotten. They were lived commitments that would reshape industrial Britain in ways that many contemporaries found almost bewildering. By the time George Cadbury took over the business, alongside his brother Richard, in the 1860s, the company had already established itself as a respectable manufacturer of chocolate. But George possessed a particular vision, one that merged commercial ambition with what we might call an almost utopian concern for human dignity. He believed, genuinely, that a worker should not merely survive on wages. A worker should live, should have a home with space around it, access to clean water, to gardens, to education, to leisure. This was radical thinking for the industrial age, an era when factory towns were choked with smoke and soot, when workers' housing was often no better than slums, when child labor remained commonplace and accepted. George began to think about where the factory should be located. In 1879, he made a decision that would echo through history. He moved Cadbury's manufacturing operation out of the congested heart of Birmingham to a rural area about 4 miles south, near the village of Bourneville. The name itself was chosen carefully, Bourne being a nearby stream, and Ville suggesting something continental, something aspirational. But what emerged there was far more than a chocolate factory. It was an experiment in how industrial work could be organized alongside human flourishing. Consider what George Cadbury actually built alongside those factory buildings. Housing for workers, substantial, well-built houses with gardens, not cramped terraces crammed into narrow streets. A school, a library, a recreation ground, facilities for swimming and sports. He designed the landscape itself with intention, preserving mature trees and creating spaces for contemplation and movement. These were not charitable provisions doled out from on high, though they were certainly rooted in Cadbury's Christian conviction. They were investments in recognizing that workers were human beings, that their dignity mattered, that their lives extended far beyond the 8 or 10 hours they spent making chocolate. The wages he paid were, for the time, remarkably generous, significantly higher than the industrial average. Women workers, who formed a substantial part of the Cadbury workforce, were treated with particular consideration. They had access to medical care, which was astonishing for the 1880s. They had maternity benefits. They could attend evening classes. Many of the early women employees at Cadbury's later became teachers or went on to other professions, something that would have been almost unthinkable in most Victorian factories. What's particularly fascinating is that this wasn't merely George Cadbury indulging in paternalism, though that impulse certainly existed. He genuinely believed that well-treated, well-housed, educated workers would be more productive, more loyal, and more capable of creating better products. And perhaps more importantly for him as a Quaker, he believed it was simply the right thing to do. Quaker theology had long held that there existed something divine in every person, that inner light that required respect and nurturing. To treat a worker with dignity was, in some sense, to honor the divine spark within them. But let us pause here and acknowledge something. This world, for all its genuine improvements, was still a deeply paternalistic one. Bournville, for all its amenities, was also a place where the factory owner exercised extraordinary control over workers' lives. There were rules about conduct, about temperance, about moral behavior. It was not exactly freedom in the modern sense. A worker lived in a company house, worked in a company factory, and existed within parameters that George Cadbury himself had defined. And yet, compared to the alternatives available to workers of that era, it represented something genuinely different, something that offered real material improvement and a recognition of human worth that was far from universal in Victorian Britain. While George was building this vision at Bournville, across in York, another Quaker family was engaged in a parallel experiment that would yield remarkably similar results, though the man at its center would take a somewhat different temperament into the work. By the 1830s, the Cadbury family had already woven themselves into the fabric of Birmingham's commercial life. John Cadbury, the founder, had established his cocoa and chocolate house in Bull Street, with a vision that went beyond mere profit, a vision rooted in the peculiar values of the Religious Society of Friends. The Quakers, you see, were not like other businessmen of their era. They carried with them a philosophy that commerce need not be divorced from conscience, that wealth could be accumulated while still honoring the dignity of those who created it. This was not universal among factory owners of the time, mind you. The Industrial Revolution had spawned a particular kind of ruthlessness, an assumption that workers existed to serve machines, and machines existed to serve profit. But John Cadbury and his contemporaries who shared his faith believed something different. What made the early Cadbury enterprise particularly interesting was the way it situated itself within this tension. John's son, John Cadbury Jr., and his other son Benjamin took over the business in the 1850s, just as Victorian England was entering a peculiar moment of moral awakening about working conditions. The chocolate trade, you must understand, had transformed from a luxury consumed by the wealthy into something that could be mass-produced and distributed across a growing middle class. There was money to be made, certainly, but the question of how that money was made and what responsibility accompanied its making was becoming impossible to ignore. The Cadburys found themselves at a crossroads, as do all businesses that inherit both fortune and principle. The year 1861 marked a turning point that would shape everything that followed. The American Civil War had disrupted cocoa supplies from across the Atlantic, and the price of raw chocolate had soared to unprecedented levels. Many factories simply passed this cost on to their consumers, or, worse still, adulterated their products with cheaper substitutes, brick dust, poisonous lead oxides, and other substances that modern sensibilities find almost incomprehensible. Yet the Cadburys, though facing genuine financial pressure, chose a different path. They invested in new machinery, in better processes, in the pursuit of purity and quality even as costs climbed around them. It was an act of faith, in a way, a belief that virtue and viability might yet walk together through the Victorian world. During these same decades, a parallel story was unfolding in York, a cathedral city in the north of England, with its own Quaker heritage running deep through generations. Henry Rowntree, a grocer with a keen eye for opportunity, had established his chocolate business with similar convictions. The Rowntree family, too, carried the quiet intensity of Quaker belief, the sense that wealth was a trust, not merely a possession, and that those who profited from others' labor bore responsibility for their well-being. Henry's son, Joseph Rowntree, born in 1836, would become the figure who truly elevated the family business from competent enterprise to something more like a moral crusade wrapped in the language of commerce. What strikes one about this period is how the two dynasties, Cadbury and Rowntree, developed in remarkable parallel without, initially, much direct contact or competition. Both were family businesses built on Quaker foundations. Both faced the same raw material challenges. Both worked with the same industrial machinery, yet interpreted their obligations differently from the prevailing ethos of the age. They were, in a curious sense, experiments in whether enlightened capitalism could actually function, whether you could build a prosperous enterprise while genuinely caring for those whose hands did the work. The answer they would give, through their choices and their investments and their willingness to forgo short-term gains for longer-term principles, would shape the very meaning of the word employer for generations to come. Consider the sheer audacity of this, unfolding across the 1860s and 1870s. Industrial England was a place of terrible contrasts, immense wealth alongside grinding poverty, grand Victorian mansions rising above the smoke-filled slums where factory workers lived 3 families to a room. Cholera epidemics swept through the cities. Children worked 12-hour days in mills and mines. The Corn Laws had only recently been repealed, and laissez-faire philosophy held that poverty was perhaps inevitable, certainly not the responsibility of those who had escaped it. Against this backdrop, the Cadburys and Rowntrees were quietly asking different questions. Not, how can we maximize our returns, but what do we owe to those whose labor makes our wealth possible? It sounds almost naive when stated so plainly, yet it was a radicalism of the gentlest kind. The radicalism of taking seriously what your religion asked of you and actually doing it. The chocolate itself, meanwhile, was undergoing its own quiet revolution. In 1868, the Dutch chocolate maker Van Houten had perfected the cocoa press, a machine that could separate cocoa butter from cocoa solids far more efficiently than ever before. This invention meant that chocolate could be manufactured with far greater consistency, with better flavor, with less labor-intensive processing. The Cadburys acquired one of these revolutionary machines and began experimenting with their formulas. They released a product called Cocoa Essence, marketed as pure, unadulterated cocoa without added substances, a direct challenge to the fraudulent practices of competitors. It was a commercial success, certainly, but it was also something else. It was a statement about what the Cadbury name would come to mean: purity, integrity, quality that reflected respect for the consumer, who trusted you, and respect for the worker, whose hands had crafted the product. By the 1870s, both the Cadbury and Rowntree families had grown wealthy enough that they could have simply retired, lived off their investments, pursued the leisured life that Victorian prosperity promised to the successful. Instead, they deepened their commitment to the business, and more importantly, they began to think on a grander scale about their moral obligations. The question that haunted them, consciously or not, was this: if your faith teaches you that all people are equal in the sight of God, how can you reconcile that with employing workers in conditions that treat them as less than human? It was not a question with an easy answer, and the ways in which they attempted to answer it would ultimately define their legacies far more than any particular product ever could. And so the business grew quietly through the 1840s and 1850s, almost unnoticed by the grander industrial stories being told across England. While the cotton mills thundered and the railways pierced through the countryside, John Cadbury was doing something rather different in his small shop on Bull Street in Birmingham. He was not simply selling cocoa and chocolate as luxury items for the wealthy. Instead, he was beginning to think about cocoa itself, about the plant, its origins, the way it was processed, and most importantly, what it might become if approached with intelligence rather than mere tradition. The cocoa that arrived in England during these years came primarily from the tropics, from plantations in the Caribbean and West Africa. It arrived as dried beans, fermented and hard, requiring significant work to transform into the brown powder that gentlemen and ladies sprinkled into hot water or milk. John Cadbury began experimenting with the cocoa bean in ways that other confectioners were not. He studied the different varieties, understanding that cocoa from different regions possessed distinctly different flavors and qualities. Some beans were more bitter, others more fragrant. Some produced a richer liquor when properly prepared. This attention to the raw material itself was not common in an era when most English cocoa manufacturers simply treated the bean as a commodity to be ground and sold. But Cadbury seemed to understand something intuitive, that quality, real quality, began at the source. The bean itself mattered. How it was dried mattered. How it was stored mattered. How it was roasted mattered. Each of these small decisions in the preparation would eventually translate into the experience of the person who drank or ate the final product. Around 1847, John Cadbury did something that would prove significant. He created the first eating chocolate, not drinking chocolate in powder form, but actual solid chocolate that could be held in the hand and consumed directly. This required a new technique altogether, one involving cocoa butter, the natural fat that exists within the cocoa bean. Most people at the time did not fully understand this fat, or how to work with it effectively, but Cadbury, through patient experimentation, developed a method to separate and recombine these elements, creating a substance that was smooth, that melted in the mouth, that had a texture previously unknown to English consumers. The innovation was subtle but revolutionary. He was not the first to create eating chocolate globally. The Spanish had been making it for centuries, but he was among the first to manufacture it in England on any significant scale, and to do so with a growing understanding of how to make it consistently good. This eating chocolate appeared on the market with a label bearing the Cadbury name, and though it was expensive, accessible only to the middle and upper classes, it began to signal something important, that here was a house, a family business, that took the craft seriously. Meanwhile, across England in York, in the north, another story was unfolding in parallel. The Rowntree family had also entered the confectionery trade, though somewhat later than Cadbury. Henry Isaac Rowntree had inherited a grocery business from his father, and by the 1860s, his sons Joseph and Henry were beginning to shift the focus of the family enterprise toward chocolate and cocoa production. York, a medieval cathedral city surrounded by open countryside, was about to become another center of chocolate manufacturing, quieter than Birmingham perhaps, more removed from the industrial heartland, but no less ambitious. Joseph Rowntree, born in 1836, would become the architect of what the Rowntree family achieved. He was, like John Cadbury, a Quaker, and he carried within him the same values: honesty in business, quality of product, but also a genuine concern for the well-being of those who worked within his employ. The early days of the Rowntree chocolate business were modest. They purchased cocoa beans, they ground them, they mixed them with sugar and other ingredients, and they sold the resulting chocolate to grocers and confectioners across the north of England. But as the 1870s approached, something was changing in the wider world that would affect both families profoundly. The Industrial Revolution had now reached a certain maturity. Machinery was becoming more sophisticated. Transport networks were expanding. Railways now connected every significant city in Britain. Chemical knowledge was advancing. And perhaps most importantly, the British appetite for sugar and sweet things was growing steadily. The empire was bringing wealth, and with wealth came a certain comfort, a certain indulgence in pleasures that had once been rare. It was into this moment of possibility that both Cadbury and Rowntree would step forward with renewed ambition. The chocolate they would help create in the coming decades would not be simply a luxury good, confined to the drawing rooms of the wealthy. It would, through their innovations and their understanding of manufacturing, become something that could eventually reach much further down into society. But that transformation would require more than good intentions. It would require vision, capital, risk, and the willingness to reinvent the business entirely. The partnership between these two great houses would reshape not merely their own fortunes, but the entire landscape of British chocolate making in ways that seemed almost inevitable once the merger was finally achieved. For nearly a century, Cadbury and Rowntree had orbited one another like planets in the same solar system, close enough to feel each other's gravity, yet maintaining their separate trajectories. Each had built their empire on principles that seemed almost identical: Quaker values, a commitment to worker welfare, a vision of chocolate not as mere confection, but as nourishment for body and soul. And yet they remained rivals, competitors in the marketplace, protective of their secrets and their territories. By the 1960s, however, the pressures mounting on British chocolate manufacturers had become undeniable. The post-war period, that hopeful time of rebuilding and renewal, had given way to an era of consolidation. Larger companies with deeper pockets were emerging across Europe and America. Traditional family businesses, no matter how well established, found themselves squeezed by modern economics. Marketing costs climbed. Competition intensified. The very things that had made these companies great, their regional character, their family stewardship, their commitment to quality over mass production, began to feel like vulnerabilities in a rapidly changing world. Rowntree, having weathered the Depression and the war, stood as a beacon of stability in York. The company that Joseph Rowntree had shepherded from a small confectioner's shop into a global enterprise was now in the hands of his descendants, stewards of a legacy that weighed upon them with increasing pressure. The question that haunted their boardrooms was not whether they would survive, but in what form and under whose control. Would the company remain independent, family-owned, true to its founding principles, or would it inevitably be absorbed into something larger, something that might not understand or honor the values embedded so deeply in its walls? Cadbury faced similar anxieties. The Midlands chocolate maker, though larger in many respects than Rowntree, could not ignore the forces reshaping industry across the Western world. Modern capitalism demanded efficiency, scale, and the relentless pursuit of profit margins. The Quaker ethos of fair dealing and worker dignity, once radical and even revolutionary in the context of Victorian manufacturing, had become almost quaint in the age of multinational corporations. How could a family business maintain such values while competing against rivals who had no such scruples? The relationship between the two companies took on new dimensions during this period. Former competitors began to see potential partners. Discussions emerged, cautious and preliminary at first, about what might be possible if their considerable resources and expertise could be combined. These conversations moved slowly, weighted with emotion and historical significance. To merge Cadbury and Rowntree would be to fundamentally alter the character of both. It would mean the end of independent family control that stretched back through generations. Yet it might also be the only way to preserve the essential character of what these companies represented in a world increasingly indifferent to heritage and principle. The negotiations that eventually led to merger were complex and prolonged, conducted by businessmen who understood that they were not simply rearranging commercial assets, but deciding the fate of institutions. What made this process particularly poignant was that both companies had already been operating under new ownership structures. The families whose names graced the products had, over the course of the 20th century, gradually diminished their direct involvement in daily management. Professional executives had been brought in. Share ownership had become more dispersed. In some ways, the merger that eventually occurred was less a dramatic rupture than a formalization of changes that had been unfolding for decades. Yet those who worked within these companies, and those who consumed their products, understood that something was indeed changing fundamentally. The merger represented a threshold, a moment when British chocolate manufacturing moved decisively from an era of family business into the modern corporate age. What emerged from this union would be larger, more efficient, more profitable, but it would also bear less of the distinctive character that had made each company special. The personal touch that had characterized management decisions, the willingness to prioritize worker welfare even when it reduced short-term returns, the sense that the company existed to serve something beyond shareholder value. These things would become harder to maintain in the merged entity. The irony, from a certain perspective, is that the very success of Cadbury and Rowntree in treating workers well, in building loyal communities around their factories, in creating products that people loved and trusted, had paradoxically made them attractive takeover targets. Their profitability, their brand strength, their market position, all of these were the fruits of pursuing values that modern business theory would have dismissed as inefficient sentimentality. And yet the market that rewarded their success would soon demand that they abandon many of those same principles in order to grow further. The factories themselves became monuments to this philosophy, spaces where the architecture whispered the values held by those who built them. Bournville, in particular, grew into something far more ambitious than a mere chocolate works. George Cadbury had inherited a business, yes, but he wielded it like an architect's tool, shaping not just confectionery, but an entire vision of how human beings might live and labor together. In the 1890s, as Bournville expanded outward across the landscape south of Birmingham, something quietly revolutionary was taking place. The factory itself was designed with an almost tender attention to the well-being of those who worked within its walls. Natural light flooded through enormous windows, a radical notion in an industrial age when most workers toiled in dimness and gloom. The air inside was ventilated, temperature controlled where possible, and the noise levels were remarkably subdued by the standards of the time. But perhaps more remarkably still, there were gardens. Within the factory grounds itself, among the cocoa processing machines and the chocolate-making apparatus, workers could encounter growing things, flowers, vegetables, small cultivated spaces that seemed to insist, without words, that even in the heart of industry, life could unfold with grace. This impulse extended far beyond the factory gates. George Cadbury purchased land surrounding Bournville with a patient, deliberate hand, and on that land he began to construct a village, not as an afterthought, not as worker housing thrown up hastily to address a labor shortage, but as a considered answer to a moral question. How might the men, women, and children who made chocolate live? What kind of homes, streets, and communities might they deserve? The houses that rose in Bournville in those early decades reflected genuine craftsmanship and comfort. They were modest, certainly, nothing lavish or ostentatious, but each one possessed its own small garden, a kitchen with running water, separate rooms for sleeping and living. These were not tenements. They were not slums. By the standards of working-class housing in industrial Britain, they were almost shockingly thoughtful. There was something almost seditious in offering factory workers such conditions. The implication, whether stated or merely felt, was revolutionary. Workers were human beings deserving of dignity, space, and contact with nature. The village itself was planned with a similar moral intentionality. There were parks laid out deliberately for public use, with trees and benches where anyone might sit and contemplate. There were schools, not just for the children of management, but for all the young people of the village. There was a meeting house, naturally, for Quaker worship, but the community also made space for other denominations. There were cooperative shops where residents could purchase food and necessities without being subjected to the exploitative markups that landlords and merchants typically imposed. Can you imagine the radical nature of this gesture in 1895? A village where rent could not be raised arbitrarily because the land was held in trust, where basic provisions were available at fair prices, where someone working in a factory could actually improve their circumstances through honest labor rather than being perpetually squeezed by unseen forces. Yet for all its idealism, Bournville was not without its contradictions and its complexities. George Cadbury believed deeply in temperance, and so there were no public houses in the village, no ale houses or public drinking establishments. This reflected his Quaker convictions entirely, but it also meant that entertainment and social life were necessarily structured in particular ways. The village had reading rooms, musical societies, sports clubs, and cultural organizations, all designed to provide wholesome amusement and community bonding. But the very absence of the pub, that traditional gathering place of working men, represented a kind of moral oversight, however benevolent in intention it might have been. There was also the question of paternalism itself, that vast and unspoken thing that hung over the entire project. George Cadbury was not merely an employer providing good wages and housing. He was a man with profound moral convictions, and those convictions shaped the very fabric of the community he was creating. Workers were expected to maintain their gardens. They were encouraged, sometimes pressured, toward moral improvement and cultural refinement. Education and self-betterment were held out as ideals, wonderful things in isolation, certainly, but also mechanisms through which the moral tone of the village could be shaped and preserved. The contrast between this vision and the harsh realities of unregulated industrial capitalism elsewhere in Britain was nonetheless profound. In Manchester, in Sheffield, in the coalfields of Wales and Durham, workers toiled in filth and danger, returned to cramped and crumbling dwellings, and had their wages perpetually squeezed downward by competition and indifference. By comparison, Bournville gleamed like an impossible dream, and yet those who lived there did not always experience it as benevolence alone. Some found it constraining, some felt watched over and judged. Others, particularly younger residents who might have wished for more traditional freedoms and amusements, chafed against the moral atmosphere that pervaded the community. How much can goodwill truly reform the inherent tension between employer and employee, between those who own and those who labor? It is a question that Bournville itself never fully resolved, though it asked it persistently through the architecture of its streets and the design of its spaces. Meanwhile, across the landscape in York, Henry Rowntree was building something not entirely different, though with its own character and emphasis. The Rowntree factory, situated on the banks of the River Ouse, was also designed with worker welfare at its centre, but the village that grew around it took a somewhat different shape, reflecting Henry's particular preoccupations and his particular reading of what moral responsibility might require. The turn toward the 20th century brought with it a peculiar tension that would define the Cadbury story for decades to come. The question of what happens when a business built on moral principle begins to collide with the very nature of commerce itself. John Cadbury's sons, Richard and George, had inherited not merely a factory and a fortune, but a philosophy, and as the industrial world accelerated around them, that philosophy would be tested in ways their father might never have anticipated. George Cadbury, the younger and more visionary of the two brothers, had become increasingly preoccupied with what one might call the architecture of human dignity. He was not content, as many manufacturers of his era were, to extract labor from workers and return only wages barely sufficient for survival. Instead, he had begun to wonder, and this is the quiet revolution of his thinking, whether a company might actually create the conditions for human flourishing, not as charity, but as something more fundamental to how business itself ought to operate. It was this question that led him, in 1879, to make a decision that would seem almost impossible to a modern executive: to relocate his entire factory. The existing works in Birmingham were cramped, polluted, surrounded by the grime and density of industrial Victorian life. George looked at his workers, many of them women, many of them children, and he asked himself whether they deserved something different. Not pity, not the grim determinism that accepted factory work as inherently dehumanizing, but genuinely different circumstances. The village of Bournville, just outside Birmingham, became the answer to that question. It was a name that itself carried meaning. Cadbury wanted to evoke the idea of a pleasant, almost rural retreat, a place where the factory would exist not as a crushing urban institution, but as part of a broader landscape of homes, gardens, and community. He purchased 14 acres of land initially, and what unfolded was nothing short of a social experiment conducted with chocolate money as its fuel. The factory that rose at Bournville was, for its time, a marvel of enlightened design. The building itself was surrounded by open space, rather than hemmed in by urban density. Windows were large and plentiful, allowing natural light to flood the workrooms, a radical notion when most factories were intentionally dark, partly from tradition and partly because darkness was thought to impose discipline. Fresh air circulated through the spaces. The work itself, while still demanding, was organized with what we might now recognize as proto-modern management thinking. Breaks were scheduled, the working day had limits, and children were not worked in the same manner as in other factories. But the factory was merely the center of something larger. George Cadbury began to build houses around it, not cramped back-to-back terraces like those where most Birmingham workers lived, but actual homes with gardens, with space for growing vegetables and flowers. He imposed strict regulations on how these houses could be built and maintained, insisting on architectural standards that seem almost quaint now, but were genuinely shocking to his contemporaries. No two houses should be identical. Every dwelling should have a garden, and certain industrial uses were simply forbidden in order to preserve the character of the place. For those moving into these homes, the experience must have been somewhat disorienting. Imagine being a factory worker, accustomed to the density and anonymity of industrial cities, and suddenly finding yourself living in something that resembled a village, with space around you, with the possibility of growing things. It was, in a very real sense, a reimagining of what a worker's life might contain. Cadbury was not simply offering employment, he was offering a different vision of existence itself. The school at Bournville represented perhaps the most forward-thinking element of the entire scheme. Education was not treated as a luxury or an afterthought, but as a fundamental right and responsibility. Young people were educated not merely in basic literacy and numeracy, but in the arts, in practical skills, in what we might now call cultural enrichment. Libraries were built, recreational facilities were constructed. There was a deliberate, almost architectural intention to cultivate not just workers, but human beings with developed minds and spirits. This sounds, in the recounting, almost utopian, and indeed, there was something utopian in George Cadbury's vision. Yet it was also, and this is important to note, fundamentally paternalistic. He was not creating a workers' cooperative where people had genuine democratic control. He was creating a world according to his vision, governed by his values, funded by his wealth. The houses were rented, not owned by their inhabitants. Rules were established and enforced. In many ways, It was a benevolent dictatorship, dressed in the language of community welfare. There is something deeply revealing about this moment in the Cadbury story, something that speaks to the complexity of philanthropic capitalism. George Cadbury was genuinely troubled by the conditions of industrial life. He genuinely believed that workers deserved better. And yet, the mechanism by which he addressed this, the accumulation of vast wealth through his business, which then allowed him to reshape the physical and social world according to his vision, contained within it a kind of structural paternalism that was difficult to escape, even with the best intentions. The interesting tension here, one worth sitting with for a moment, is that Bournville was simultaneously more humane and more controlling than the alternatives available at the time. A worker in most factories faced exploitation and neglect. A worker at Bournville faced dignity and provision, but within a system entirely designed and controlled by their employer. The question of whether this represented genuine progress or merely a more sophisticated form of control is one that social historians have grappled with ever since, and it is not one that admits of easy answers. Nevertheless, Bournville represented something genuinely new in the landscape of industrial Britain. News of the village spread. It became, in a sense, a model, a proof of concept that suggested alternatives to the grim determinism of Manchester-style industrial organisation. Other employers began to pay attention. Some built their own model villages. The idea that a business might have responsibilities extending beyond mere profit-making began, however slowly, to take root in the soil of capitalist thinking. What is remarkable, looking back from our present moment, is how radical this actually was. We live in an era when corporate social responsibility is often presented as a kind of moral achievement, something for which companies deserve credit and praise. Yet in many cases, it amounts to far less than what George Cadbury was actually building at Bournville in the 1880s. He was not simply making charitable donations or sponsoring cultural events. He was fundamentally restructuring the relationship between capital and labour, attempting to imagine a form of employment that was not simply extractive. The chocolate itself, during these years, continued to evolve and improve. The business was expanding, moving into new products and new markets. But increasingly, Bournville and what it represented began to define the Cadbury identity in a way that the chocolate alone could not. The company was becoming a story about values, about the possibility of doing good through commerce, about the belief that wealth accumulated could be redirected toward human flourishing. It is worth asking, in these quieter hours, what draws certain people toward this kind of thinking? What psychological or spiritual element makes someone like George Cadbury look at a system, industrial capitalism, that was working quite well for him in purely financial terms, and decide that it was nonetheless fundamentally wrong? His Quaker faith surely played a role, that tradition of seeking the inner light and of believing in the fundamental equality and worth of all people. But there is also something more personal, something about how particular individuals come to see the world that produces this kind of vision. The years following the establishment of Bournville saw the village gradually expand and develop, becoming increasingly complex and intentional in its design. The experiment was, in many ways, succeeding. Workers were healthier, more stable in their employment, more engaged with the work itself. Productivity remained high, quality remained excellent, and this created a kind of virtuous cycle. The better conditions attracted better workers. The better workers produced better results. The better results generated more wealth, which could be reinvested in further improvements. The expansion of Rowntree's beyond the confines of York was not a simple matter of opening new factories or shipping more boxes across the country. It required a fundamental rethinking of how chocolate manufacturing could be organized at scale, how quality could be maintained across distance, and perhaps most intriguingly, how the principles that had made the company successful in a small Yorkshire city could somehow travel and take root in new soil. By the early 20th century, the Rowntree family had begun to recognize that their growth was becoming constrained by geography. York was thriving, yes, but the appetite for their products had begun to outstrip what the machinery and the local labor force could reasonably produce. There was a peculiar tension at the heart of this realization, the very paternalism that had defined their relationship with their workers, the housing they provided, the education they offered, the moral certainties they promoted, was tied deeply to the place itself. Could those values be transplanted, or would they wither in the alien soil of another region? The decision to establish a new factory came gradually, through conversations and family councils that stretched across seasons. The Rowntrees considered several locations, weighing the availability of labor, proximity to rail lines, the character of the local population, and something harder to quantify but no less important to them, whether a place seemed suited to their vision of what a factory town could become. When they finally settled on Ivers, in Buckinghamshire, it was with both cautious optimism and a measure of uncertainty. Ivers was small, rural, and in many ways quite different from York. It lacked the deeply rooted Quaker community that had shaped so much of Rowntree's culture. The workers who would come there were not drawn from generations of families already embedded in the company's ethos, and yet there was something about the location that appealed to the Rowntrees. It was accessible by rail, it was growing as a region, and there was a sense that something new might be built there, not simply a copy of what existed in York, but perhaps a variant, an evolution of the same fundamental principles. The construction of the Ivers factory, beginning in the early years of the 20th century, was itself a remarkable undertaking. The Rowntrees did not simply hire a contractor and stand aside. Family members were involved in the design process, in the specification of machinery, in the planning of not just the factory floor, but the entire arrangement of the site. They thought carefully about how light would enter the working spaces, how air would circulate, how materials would flow from one stage of production to the next. There was something almost architectural about their approach, a sense that the layout of a chocolate factory could either constrain or liberate the spirit of those who worked within it. The machinery that was installed at Ivers represented the cutting edge of chocolate-making technology of that era. The Rowntrees had always been willing to invest in innovation, to seek out the newest methods and the most sophisticated equipment available. Where other chocolate makers might have seen such investment as extravagant, the Rowntrees saw it as an extension of their philosophy. Better machinery meant safer working conditions, more consistent results, less manual labor required for the heaviest and most dangerous tasks. It was an investment not just in productivity, but in the dignity of work itself. But machinery, however advanced, was only one element. The Rowntrees understood that a factory was a living organism, dependent on the knowledge, skill, and commitment of the people within it. They began recruiting workers for Ivers with a particular care and intentionality. Some were drawn from York, experienced hands who could help establish standards and transmit the culture of the company to newcomers. Others were hired locally, young people and women who received training and were gradually integrated into the rhythms and expectations of Rowntree's work. The provision of housing at Ivers followed the York model, though adapted to the circumstances of a smaller, more dispersed community. The Rowntrees built cottages and arranged financing that made it possible for workers to purchase their own homes. This was not a gift, but nor was it a purely commercial transaction. It was an investment in stability, in commitment, in the idea that workers who owned property in the community where they worked would naturally take greater interest in the prosperity and character of that place. There was also a deliberate effort to establish cultural and educational institutions at Ivers. A small schoolhouse was built, recreational facilities were provided. The Rowntrees, following their Quaker convictions, saw it as important that workers and their families should have access not just to employment, but to the means of self-improvement, to education, to wholesome leisure activities. The assumption underlying all of this was that people were fundamentally good, capable of growth, and responsive to kindness and opportunity. Yet for all this careful planning and genuine idealism, the Ivers factory never quite achieved the same cultural significance as York. Perhaps it was inevitable that the original site would retain a special place in the company's imagination. Perhaps the paternalism that worked in York, where it emerged organically from long relationships and deep community roots, felt somewhat more imposed when transplanted to Buckinghamshire. Or perhaps it was simply that the moment in history had shifted. By the time Ivers was becoming established, the world was entering a period of unprecedented turbulence. The certainties that had sustained Victorian and Edwardian England were beginning to crack. The First World War would soon arrive, with all the disruptions and upheavals it would bring. By the early 20th century, the Rowntree factory at York had become something of a cathedral to progress. The buildings themselves rose in brick and glass, and within them, the air was thick with the perfume of roasting cocoa beans, a scent so enveloping that workers from neighboring districts could identify the factory by smell alone, even on the stillest of days. But beneath this almost romantic image of chocolate making lay something far more calculated. The Rowntrees were intensely aware that their success would only endure if they could prove to the world, and more importantly, to themselves, that their wealth served a higher purpose. This philosophy manifested in ways both visible and deeply structural. Henry Isaac Rowntree, who had taken the lead of the company after his father John's death in 1884, carried within him an almost restless compulsion to do good. Unlike some philanthropists of the era, who donated funds from a distance, Henry believed that morality had to be woven into the very fabric of production. The chocolate business, he reasoned, should not simply produce sweetness for the body, it should foster sweetness in the souls of those who made it. And so the factory began to evolve, slowly at first, then with increasing intentionality. The model villages that both Cadbury and Rowntree championed were not mere housing projects. They represented something more akin to an ideology, a belief that the way people lived fundamentally shaped the way they worked, and the way they worked shaped the world they inhabited. Consider for a moment the living conditions of an industrial worker in late Victorian England. Tenements in industrial towns were often damp, crowded, poorly lit affairs. Families of 6 or 8 might occupy 2 or 3 rooms. Sanitation was questionable. Disease moved through these spaces like an unwelcome guest, and childhood mortality rates were not infrequent topics of grim conversation. To step from such conditions into a Rowntree cottage, with its own small garden, its proper ventilation, its nearby schoolhouse and clinic, the contrast would have been almost overwhelming. Joseph Rowntree, Henry's younger brother, expanded this vision with particular passion. Though Henry managed the factory itself, Joseph became increasingly absorbed in the broader architecture of social welfare. He established what would later be formalized as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, an institution that would outlive him by well over a century and reshape the landscape of charitable giving in Britain. Joseph had travelled, observed, read widely in the emerging social sciences, and had come to believe that poverty was not a moral failing, but a structural problem. This was a radical position for the time. Most wealthy Victorians believed that the poor were poor because they were idle, intemperate, or spiritually deficient. Joseph argued instead that you could take a perfectly capable person, place them in poverty, and watch their capabilities shrivel simply because their circumstances offered no room for growth. The factory villages became, in some sense, a laboratory for testing these theories. Bourneville, which had been established by George Cadbury in 1879, had come to include not only homes but schools, churches, swimming pools, and recreational grounds. The Rowntree Factory Folk Club, established in 1897, offered workers access to libraries, lectures, and musical performances. These institutions operated on the principle that an educated, healthy, culturally engaged workforce would be a productive and loyal one. But there was something else at work as well, something less obviously instrumental. There was a genuine, if paternalistic, affection for the people who made their chocolate. Many of the factory owners knew their workers by name. They visited the sick, they attended the funerals, they believed, or at least convinced themselves, that they were engaged in something akin to a family enterprise. This relationship between employer and employee was complicated, naturally. Modern readers might see in it elements of control and manipulation. The companies issued strict codes of conduct. Workers, particularly women, faced rules about their appearance, their behavior outside the factory, their associations. An unmarried woman who became pregnant faced dismissal. A man who visited the public house too frequently might find his standing with the company in jeopardy. The paternalism, for all its genuine concern, carried with it an assumption of the factory owner's right to shape the moral and social lives of those beneath him. Yet it would be a mistake to view these arrangements as purely coercive. For many workers, the Rowntree and Cadbury factories represented something like a golden ticket. The wages, while not lavish, were considerably higher than those available in other forms of labour. The working conditions, though long and often intense, were monitored for safety in ways that were not standard in the factories of the time. Workers knew that if they fell ill, there would be medical attention. If their family faced hardship, there were channels through which help might come. The psychological contract, if you will, was that in exchange for loyalty, dedication, and moral uprightness, the company would care for you. It is not difficult to see why, under such circumstances, many workers developed deep attachments to their employers. By the first decade of the 20th century, the chocolate industry in Britain had become something of a mirror in which the nation's anxieties and aspirations could be reflected. The rise of Cadbury and Rowntree coincided with anxieties about industrial progress, questions about the moral dimensions of commerce, and a growing awareness that the old certainties of Victorian society were beginning to shift. The First World War, when it came, would disrupt many things, but it would also accelerate certain trends that were already underway. The factories themselves became monuments to this Quaker philosophy, and it is perhaps here that the truly fascinating paradox emerges. These were not the dark, satanic mills of the industrial North that so troubled the conscience of the age. Instead, Cadbury and Rowntree had designed something altogether different, a vision of manufacturing that aspired, however imperfectly, toward human dignity. The physical spaces where chocolate was made became arguments about what industrial life could be, if only those who owned the means of production cared enough to imagine it. John Cadbury's decision to move his chocolate works from the cramped quarters of Birmingham city centre to a greenfield site south of the city, which he named Bourneville, was not made on a whim. He purchased land in 1878, choosing an area of natural beauty surrounded by fields and water, and in doing so, he was making a statement about what he believed workers deserved. Around the factory, he built an entire village, houses with gardens, schools, a library, recreational grounds where men and women could play cricket or tennis in the evening hours. There was a swimming pool, and later, a department store where Cadbury employees could purchase goods at reduced prices. The very architecture of daily life was being reimagined. What made this particularly striking, and perhaps what makes it still worth contemplating as we consider the texture of history, is that Cadbury did not build these amenities as some distant philanthropist dispensing charity from afar. He lived there. His family occupied substantial homes within Bournville, and he walked the same streets, attended the same meetings, breathed the same air as the people who worked in his factories. There was something almost intimate about the experiment, though one must pause here and acknowledge that intimacy and paternalism are not always easy to distinguish. Did he believe in the equality of his workers, or did he believe in managing their lives according to his own vision of what was good for them? The answer is probably that both impulses existed simultaneously, as they so often do in human affairs. Meanwhile, in York, some 70 miles to the north, Henry Rowntree was conducting a parallel experiment. The Rowntree family had been in the chocolate business for far longer than the Cadburys. Their history reached back to the 1760s, but it was Henry and his brother Joseph who transformed it into an industrial concern of genuine significance. In 1887, just a few years after Cadbury's removal to Bournville, Rowntree relocated his factory to a site called Haxby Road, on the outskirts of York. There, he too began to construct something more than a place of manufacture. The parallels between Bournville and the Rowntree village are striking, yet the differences reveal much about how two men might pursue similar dreams through distinct temperaments. Rowntree built housing for his workers, good housing, with proper drainage and adequate light, which were not universal luxuries in Victorian England. He established a system of profit sharing, an innovation that allowed his workforce to participate in the gains their labour produced. There was a girls' club, a women's institute, a sports ground, and like Cadbury, Rowntree embedded himself within this landscape. His moral vision was not something handed down from on high, but something he attempted to live within, day by day. But it is important to linger here, in this middle stretch of the story, on what these visions actually accomplished and what they necessarily could not. The Quaker commitment to fair treatment, to education, to community welfare was genuine. One can read the historical record and find numerous accounts of workers whose lives were materially improved by access to good housing, to schooling for their children, to the possibility of modest prosperity. The death rates in these model villages were lower than in surrounding industrial areas. The literacy rates were higher. Children attended school rather than working 14-hour days in mills. These are facts worth honouring, worth remembering. And yet the fundamental relationship remained what it had always been. The workers at Bournville and Haxby Road still worked for wages determined by their employers. They still laboured according to a rhythm set by the factory whistle. The paternalism, however benevolent, was still paternalism. A worker could not simply decide to relocate if they wished to leave the village. The company maintained significant control over the moral and social life of the community. There were temperance campaigns against alcohol. There were expectations about how people should conduct themselves. There was, in other words, a price attached to the benevolence, and that price was a surrender of certain autonomies, certain freedoms, certain rights to self-determination. This is not to say that the Cadburys and Rowntrees were hypocrites, or that their efforts were worthless. Rather, it is to acknowledge a fundamental truth about the Victorian era, and, perhaps, about the human impulse toward improvement itself. Even the most thoughtfully conceived solutions contain within them the seeds of their own contradictions. Two well-meaning industrialists could build model villages, could genuinely improve the material conditions of thousands, and could simultaneously reproduce the power asymmetries that defined industrial capitalism. Both things were true. Both things remain true. The grandeur of these visions, though, should not be diminished by this sobering observation. For in the context of their time, in the context of factories that poisoned the air and child labor that crippled the body. In the context of slums where disease moved through families like a patient predator, Bourneville and Haxby Road represented something close to revolution. They represented a deliberate choice to ask, what if we did it differently? What if we acknowledged that the people who produced our wealth were also human beings worthy of health, of education, of beauty in their daily lives? The answer that Cadbury and Rowntree gave to these questions took material form. It could be walked through, it could be inhabited, and in the hands of their successors, in the generations that followed, these physical testaments to a particular kind of industrial idealism would come to mean something quite different, as ideals so often do when inherited by those who did not conceive them. The social philosophy that guided the Cadbury family did not arrive fully formed the moment John Cadbury opened his shop. It crystallized slowly, through encounter and conviction as the 19th century deepened and the family's wealth grew alongside their moral awareness. By the time the second generation was coming of age, particularly under George Cadbury Sr., a distinct vision had taken shape, one that would eventually reshape not only how chocolate was made, but how workers and communities might actually be cared for in an age of unprecedented industrial expansion. What strikes the modern observer is how deliberately, how almost methodically, George pursued what he called his industrial Christianity. It was not sentiment, it was not the distant charity of a wealthy man throwing coins at orphanages. It was a coherent system of belief that the employer bore a direct spiritual responsibility for the well-being of those who labored in his factories. This was radical in the 1880s and 1890s. Most mill owners in Birmingham and Manchester treated their workers as interchangeable units of production, something to be used up and replaced. George Cadbury saw them differently. He saw souls, and he believed that if you treated those souls with dignity, housed them properly, fed them well, educated their children, and gave them space to breathe and rest, something transformative would happen. The actual factory that embodied this vision was not built on the old site in Birmingham. In 1879, George made the decision to relocate. He chose a site just outside the city, in a rural area near the hamlet of Bourneville, in Worcestershire. The name itself was deliberate, a nod to the River Bourne that ran through the land, and to Cadbury's identification with the continental chocolate traditions. But the choice of location was everything. By moving out of the industrial heart of the city, George was rejecting the model of the Victorian factory town, where workers lived in cramped, polluted housing, directly adjacent to the mills. Here, on open land, with space to grow, he could build something different. Bourneville was conceived not simply as a factory surrounded by worker housing, but as an entirely new kind of settlement. Between 1879 and the early 20th century, George developed the estate in phases. First came the factory itself, spacious, well-lit, with careful attention paid to ventilation and sanitation. By the standards of the time, it was shockingly advanced. There were no child workers, which was still a point of distinction in some industries. There were reasonable working hours. There was a school on site. But more than that, there was what we might now call a holistic approach to workers' lives. The houses built for the workers were not the mean uniform rows that characterized so much Victorian working-class housing. They had space around them. They had gardens, and this mattered enormously to George's philosophy, because he believed that the act of growing things, of cultivating the earth, was spiritually redemptive. Each house had enough land that a worker family could grow vegetables, keep chickens, maybe a pig. They were built of good materials, with proper sanitation and ventilation. Rents were deliberately kept below the market rate, so that workers were not spending every penny simply to shelter themselves and their families. But beyond the physical infrastructure, George created what was almost a complete alternative society within Bournville. There were parks and recreation grounds, there was a library, there were schools, not just for the children of workers, but evening classes for adults. There was a swimming pool, which would have seemed like an almost unimaginable luxury to most working people of the era. There were cooperative societies, where workers could purchase goods at fair prices, rather than at the inflated rates the local shopkeepers might charge. There was music, bands, choirs, orchestras, because George believed that access to culture and beauty was as essential to human flourishing as bread and water. What is particularly fascinating, when you look closely at the historical record, is how George struggled with certain aspects of this paternalism. The early documents and letters reveal a man wrestling with genuine questions. How much should an employer control the moral and social life of workers? If you provide housing, do you have the right to set rules about behavior? How far could benevolence go before it became coercion? There were strict regulations about alcohol in the early days of Bournville, not because George was a killjoy, but because he had seen alcoholism destroy families in the industrial slums. Yet even he, by the end of his life, seems to have softened on this, recognizing that rules about how workers spent their leisure time crossed a certain invisible boundary. This is perhaps what makes the Cadbury vision different from simple charity or paternalism of a more purely controlling sort. George was, in his way, asking the question that would come to define much 20th century social thought. What does it actually mean to respect the dignity of working people? His answer was not abstract. It was concrete, material, embodied in bricks and gardens and schools and opportunity. He believed that people could not be spiritually or morally healthy if they were exhausted, underfed, ill-housed, and without access to beauty or culture. So he built that access into the fabric of the place. The response from workers was, by most accounts, profound. Bournville attracted skilled workers from across the country, people who had heard about the wages, the conditions, the opportunity. There was a waiting list to work at the Cadbury factory. This was not because workers were fooled or infantilized, though it is fair to say that George's vision did contain within it some assumptions about what working people should want and value. It was because, in material terms, the offer was genuinely better than anything else available. You could earn decent wages, your children could be educated, your family could live in a house you did not have to fear would collapse in winter. You could work in clean conditions. You had time to rest. These were not luxuries, they were basic human needs, and they were not being met anywhere else in industrial Britain. What happened in Bournville began to reverberate. Other employers, not many, but some, began to ask whether the Cadbury model might be replicable. The whole concept of the model industrial village, the company town built around principles of worker welfare, gained a kind of cultural currency in the late Victorian and Edwardian era. George opened Bournville to visitors, to journalists, to other industrialists and social reformers. He was not shy about what he had built. He believed it vindicated his entire philosophy, that profit and paternalism, if guided by genuine religious conviction, could be compatible, and that the result would be happier workers, less labor unrest, and ultimately a more stable society. The Rowntree family, in York, watching these developments with great interest, began to ask their own questions. Joseph Rowntree Sr. had built his chocolate business into something substantial by the 1880s, but he was aging, and his sons were beginning to take on greater responsibility. The eldest, Henry Isaac, showed less interest in the business than in social reform, but the second son, Joseph Jr., was different. He had his father's commercial acumen, but he also had something else, a genuine intellectual engagement with the social question of the age. What was the responsibility of the wealthy toward the poor? How could you make money and still sleep at night, knowing what you knew about the conditions in which most people lived? Joseph Rowntree Jr. visited Bournville, and what he saw moved him profoundly. Here was proof, he believed, that an alternative was possible. Here was a man, not necessarily cleverer than himself, not necessarily more virtuous in some abstract sense, but willing to act on his convictions, who had created something that worked. A factory that was profitable, a workforce that was stable and content, and a community that was, by the standards of the age, thriving. If George Cadbury could do this in Birmingham, why not do something similar in York? By the 1890s, Joseph Rowntree began his own deliberate program of industrial and social reform. It was in some ways influenced by Bournville, the same underlying conviction that the employer bore responsibility for worker welfare, the same belief that access to decent housing and education and beauty mattered. But Rowntree, over time, would develop something slightly different. Where Cadbury leaned toward a kind of benevolent control, Rowntree, perhaps because he read more widely in social theory, perhaps because of his own temperament, became interested in something closer to a genuine, if still paternalistic, partnership between capital and labour. His chocolate factory in York would be shaped by this slightly different vision. Not identical to Bournville, but born from the same impulse, refined by a different sensibility. The chocolate empire they had built was not merely a business. It was, in many ways, an extension of their deepest beliefs, a physical manifestation of Quaker principle, made profitable and widespread. And yet, as the 20th century began to gather momentum, as the world shifted beneath their feet with new technologies and new hungers, both the Cadbury and Rowntree families found themselves standing at a peculiar crossroads. Success had arrived almost too completely. The factories hummed with purpose, the brands had become household names. But the question that began to whisper through the boardrooms and the family homes was this: what happens when the engine of commerce grows so large that it threatens to overshadow the moral engine that gave it fuel? By the 1920s, the Rowntree factory at York had become one of the most advanced and philosophically ambitious manufacturing spaces in the world. Henry Isaac Rowntree, the third generation of his line to oversee the business, was a man of both sentiment and pragmatism. He inherited not just a chocolate company, but a very specific idea about what that company ought to be. A place where work ennobled rather than diminished, where the relationship between employer and worker was governed by conscience as much as contract. The Rowntree workers enjoyed benefits that seemed almost fantastical to those labouring elsewhere. A 5-day week, which was radical for its time, subsidised meals, a works orchestra, recreation grounds where families could gather on their day of rest. But there was also a tension, subtle but persistent, woven through these generous provisions. The paternalism that undergirded them, while undeniably born from genuine concern, carried within it an assumption of moral authority, the idea that the factory owner, in his wisdom and benevolence, knew what was best for those who worked within his walls. The workers were cared for, yes, but they were also observed, guided, sometimes gently corrected. It was a form of love, perhaps, but it was love wielded from above. The Cadbury family, meanwhile, had moved through a similar evolution in Bournville. The village they had imagined and built continued to expand, to refine itself. New housing rose with every passing year, each dwelling a small testament to what a manufacturer with resources and conscience might accomplish. The model village had become world famous, a destination for social reformers and curious industrialists from across Europe and beyond. When people spoke of Bournville, they often did so with a kind of reverence. Here, it seemed, was proof that capitalism and human dignity need not be enemies. And yet, within this vision of perfect order and benevolent care, there were those who chafed. Not all workers wanted to be reformed. Not all families were grateful for the guidance their employers offered. Some began to whisper about autonomy, about the difference between kindness and control, about what it might mean to be cared for so thoroughly that you were scarcely allowed to care for yourself. These whispers would, in time, become louder. The First World War intervened in these domestic conversations, as it intervened in so much. Both Cadbury and Rowntree faced a profound moral crisis. The families were Quakers, and Quakerism taught pacifism as an almost sacred obligation. Yet the war demanded chocolate. It demanded, in fact, that they participate in the vast machinery of national defense and military supply. How does one remain true to a faith that abhors violence when one's very products, wrapped in patriotic rhetoric and shipped to soldiers on the front lines, become instruments of war? The Cadburys and Rowntrees made their choice, and it was not a simple one. Some members of the family, faithful to their Quaker convictions, refused military service and endured the social and legal consequences. Others, wrestling with conscience, decided that providing sustenance to those who had to fight, even if they themselves would not fight, was a way to minimize suffering. The chocolate factories became, in effect, instruments of the war effort. Millions of bars were produced for British soldiers, soldiers from the Empire, soldiers fighting across a continent in trenches of mud and blood. When the war ended, the world it had shattered slowly began to reassemble itself, but never quite in the same shape. The social order that had seemed so stable, so natural, had been revealed as fragile. There were new ideas in the air, ideas about workers' rights, about the dignity of labor, about whether benevolent paternalism was sufficient or whether something more democratic might be required. The chocolate dynasties, for all their genuine concern and their real accomplishments in the realm of worker welfare, would find themselves tested by these new currents. And it was during this period, in the 1920s and early 1930s, that something began to shift within the Rowntree family specifically. A younger generation was coming into influence, and they brought with them a different sensibility. They had grown up surrounded by the physical evidence of their family's wealth and their family's conscience, but they were also children of a new age. Some of them would become revolutionaries of a sort, not politically radical, but radical in their thinking about what business might be for, what it might accomplish beyond the production of goods and the accumulation of capital. One figure who emerged during this period was Benjamin Seebohm Rowntree, who was neither the patriarch nor a founder, but a son of the founder, and who would prove to be something of a visionary in his own right. Seebohm, as he was known, was born into privilege but educated in conscience. He was not content simply to inherit and preserve. He wanted to examine, to question, to understand. And what he became obsessed with, in ways that would define much of his life's work, was the question of poverty itself. How could he, a man of great wealth, who lived in a world of chocolate and gardens and comfortable homes, understand the lives of those who had nothing? This question would drive him to do something remarkable, something almost anthropological in its ambition. In the early years of the 20th century, he began to conduct what might be called the first serious sociological study of poverty in Britain. He walked the streets of York. He visited workers' homes. He gathered data, statistics, observations. He created something called a poverty line, an attempt to measure, scientifically and precisely, what it actually cost to live, to eat, to survive with dignity. It was groundbreaking work, and it would influence social policy for generations to come. And what did he find, this young man stepping out from his family's considerable comfort into the reality of working-class life? He found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that poverty was far more extensive, far more systematic, than most of the wealthy chose to acknowledge. He found that many workers, despite having employment, despite having work, lived in conditions of genuine hardship. Their wages, when stretched across rent and food and the endless needs of children, left them perpetually short. They lived with anxiety as a constant companion, with the knowledge that a single illness, a single accident, could tip them into destitution. This discovery, though it was not truly a discovery so much as a careful documentation of what had always been true, unsettled something within him. Here he was, a member of a family that had built its reputation on the benevolence it extended to its workers, and yet those workers, for all the benefits they received, for all the recreation grounds and subsidized meals and 5-day weeks, were still struggling. The chocolate was still being made. The empire was still expanding, but somewhere, in the mathematics of profit and wage, something remained unbalanced. It was a realization that would echo through the rest of his life, and it would push him toward a kind of engaged intellectualism that was rare among captains of industry. He would go on to study economics, to write treatises on poverty and social reform, to advocate for minimum wages and social security, before such concepts had even acquired their modern names. He became, in effect, a bridge, a man of great wealth and privilege, who used his position not simply to preserve what he had inherited, but to interrogate it, to question whether it could be made more just, more genuinely aligned with the moral convictions that his family claimed to hold. And all the while, the chocolate factories continued to hum. The workers continued to make their bars of chocolate, bars that would be eaten by people across the British Empire and beyond. The Rowntree name and the Cadbury name continued to signify a certain kind of business, one with a conscience, or at least the appearance of one. But within the families, within the boardrooms, within the minds of thoughtful people like Seabohm Rowntree, a question was beginning to take on greater and greater weight. Was conscience enough? Was benevolent paternalism sufficient? Or was there something more, something harder, something that required not just kindness from above, but a genuine restructuring of the relationship between capital and labor? It was a question that would not find easy answers, but the asking of it, in this period between the wars, marked a kind of evolution in how these chocolate dynasties understood themselves and their role in a changing world. The question of what happened to these vast fortunes, these accumulated treasures built brick by brick across generations, became increasingly urgent as the 20th century progressed, and both families found themselves navigating a world that was changing faster than any of their predecessors could have imagined. The Second World War had shaken everything. Young men from both the Cadbury and Rowntree families had served, some with distinction, and the nation that emerged from those dark years was fundamentally different from the one their great-grandfathers had known. The certainties that had underpinned Victorian and Edwardian commerce, the assumption that family firms would remain family firms, that wealth accumulated through generations would naturally pass through the same bloodlines. These certainties had begun to crack and shift like the surface of a frozen pond in spring. Within the Cadbury family, this tension became particularly acute. The chocolate business itself was immensely profitable, yes, but it was also becoming increasingly complex. The machinery of modern commerce, the rise of supermarkets, the emergence of American competitors with capital and technologies that seemed almost limitless, the changing tastes of consumers who were beginning to demand convenience and novelty alongside quality. All of this required not just careful stewardship, but active, innovative response. And the question that began to preoccupy the family, sometimes spoken aloud and sometimes merely whispered in boardrooms and drawing rooms, was whether the family itself contained enough talent, enough hunger, enough modern vision to meet these challenges, or whether the time had come to ask whether keeping the business within the family was actually the wisest course. There was something almost melancholic about this realization, something tinged with a gentle acknowledgement of decline that only families who have known genuine power and purpose across generations can truly feel. It is one thing to inherit a fortune. It is quite another to sense that the circumstances that made that fortune possible, that gave it meaning and direction, have begun to slip away like sand through fingers. The Cadburys and the Rowntrees had not been mere investors, men who happened to own shares in chocolate companies. They had been, in the deepest sense, makers. They had shaped towns, influenced culture, created livelihoods for thousands. They had woven their values, Quaker honesty, Quaker concern for the welfare of workers, Quaker intellectual curiosity, directly into the very fabric of their enterprises. And now, as the post-war decades unfolded, they faced a choice that previous generations had largely been spared: to release what they had built into the hands of professional managers and distant shareholders, or to cling to control in ways that might ultimately weaken the very thing they sought to protect. The Rowntree family navigated this territory first, in many respects. Joseph Rowntree Jr., the son of the great philanthropist, found himself leading the company through the 1920s and 1930s, periods of considerable stress for the British economy. He was a thoughtful man, educated, concerned with the welfare of his workers much as his father had been, but he was also a realist. He understood that sentiment and memory alone could not sustain a modern business. Around him, the landscape of British industry was changing. Larger firms were consolidating. American methods were arriving: assembly line production, aggressive marketing, mass distribution. The family firm, however distinguished, began to feel increasingly like a relic of an earlier age, sustained not by inevitable economic forces, but by the talents and luck of individuals who happened to be born with the right name. It was against this backdrop that the Rowntree family made a decision that, while not completely severing family ties to the business, fundamentally altered the nature of that relationship. In 1930, with careful deliberation and a degree of heavy hearts, the family restructured the company. They established a trust, a legal mechanism that would preserve the company's independence while gradually shifting control from direct family governance toward trustees and, eventually, professional managers. The business itself remained Rowntree's. That was never in doubt. The chocolate would still be made in York. The workers would still benefit from the schemes and support that had made Rowntree's a model employer. But the idea that a Rowntree necessarily had to lead the Rowntree company, that assumption had been gently released. There was wisdom in this, though it was a wisdom gained through resignation, as much as through clear-eyed strategic thinking. Joseph Rowntree Jr. understood something that many family business leaders never fully grasp: that protecting a legacy sometimes requires letting go of the direct reins of control. It is a paradox that echoes through the history of great enterprises. Hold too tightly, and you risk stifling the very adaptability that ensures survival. Release too completely, and you risk watching what you built be dismantled or corrupted by those who have no connection to its founding purposes. The Rowntrees, it seems, attempted to thread that needle, to find a middle path. Meanwhile, over in Birmingham, the Cadbury family was wrestling with remarkably similar questions, though in their case, the answer would take a rather different form. Edward Cadbury, who had led the company with such energy through the early decades of the 20th century, had been succeeded eventually by his son Lawrence. Lawrence inherited a company that was in many respects at the height of its power, hugely profitable, commanding enormous market share, with brands and products that had become woven into the fabric of British life. Cadbury's wasn't just a chocolate maker, it was an institution. It was what you bought for a loved one at Christmas. It was what came in the coronation packages when the Queen was crowned. It was, in some ineffable way, British. Yet even this supremacy brought with it a certain vulnerability. As the company grew larger and more complex, As the number of Cadbury family members involved in active management began to dwindle relative to the size of the enterprise, new questions began to arise with increased insistence. Was it fair to the family members who had no particular aptitude for business to expect them to benefit from dividends and shares? Was it wise to confine the top positions exclusively to family members when the company now employed tens of thousands of people and competed in markets that were becoming increasingly sophisticated and international? And beneath these practical questions lay another, more philosophical one. What did it mean to be a Cadbury in the middle of the 20th century? What obligations did inheritance carry with it, and what rights did it grant? The Cadburys, like the Rowntrees, were Quakers, and this fact cannot be separated from the way they approached these questions. Quaker theology has always contained within it a certain tension between the accumulation of wealth and the equality of souls before God. There is no priesthood in Quaker belief, no hierarchy of spiritual authority. And while this did not necessarily translate directly into political egalitarianism, the early great Quaker merchants and manufacturers were not socialists, and they did not distribute their wealth equally among all citizens. It did mean that they carried within their worldview a steady, unquiet conscience about inequality and injustice. A Quaker conscience does not rest easily with dynastic privilege. It nags. It asks uncomfortable questions. It suggests that perhaps the accumulation of power and wealth through mere accident of birth sits uneasily with genuinely held Quaker values. This inner conflict, though rarely articulated in those exact terms, began to manifest in how both families approached the question of succession and control. They were not the sort of dynasts who simply assumed that their children would lead grand dynasties, that generation after generation would inherit thrones of power. Instead, there emerged a quiet acknowledgement that perhaps the time was coming, not immediately, but inevitably, when the family would need to step back, when professional managers and boards of directors would need to assume more direct responsibility, when the business would need to evolve beyond being a family enterprise into something more institutional, more impersonal, and perhaps more sustainable as a result. This acceptance did not come all at once, and it did not come without moments of doubt and nostalgia. How could it not feel like a loss to those who had grown up believing that the family's fate and the company's fate were inextricably intertwined? To release control is, in some sense, to acknowledge that the age of the family dynasty is ending. It is to admit that inherited wealth and position, no matter how responsibly managed, cannot indefinitely insulate a family from the great currents of social and economic change that flow through history. The chocolate kingdoms that had seemed, in the Victorian era, as though they might be eternal, as though they represented a new and permanent order of things, were in fact subject to the same inexorable forces that had pulled down every dynasty before them: time, change, the emergence of new competitors, the shifting values of consumers and workers alike. These things do not respect nostalgia or history, no matter how distinguished. The chocolate houses themselves, those grand Victorian structures rising from the factory grounds, became monuments to an ideology that was, perhaps, unusually progressive for their era. Both the Cadbury family and the Rowntree family understood something fundamental about the human condition, that those who labored in the creation of pleasure deserved, themselves, to experience some measure of dignity, comfort, and rest. This was not mere sentiment, though sentiment certainly played a role. It was rooted in their deepest religious convictions, the belief that every soul carried equal worth in the eyes of their God, and that this worth should be reflected in how they lived their daily lives. John Cadbury's sons, Richard and George, inherited not just a business, but a moral obligation, and they pursued it with remarkable consistency. By the latter decades of the 19th century, Cadbury Bros had grown substantially, and the original factory in Bridge Street had become impossibly cramped. In 1879, a decision was made that would reshape not merely the company, but the very landscape of industrial chocolate making. They would build something entirely new, something that reflected their values in brick and stone and carefully planned space. They purchased 14 acres of land, some 4 miles south of Birmingham, in a place called Bourneville, a small hamlet surrounded by open countryside. The word Bourneville itself was carefully chosen. It spoke of the Bourne stream that flowed through the land, and of the French word ville, evoking a sense of continental sophistication and planning. But there was poetry in the choice, too. This would not be merely a factory in the harsh industrial sense. It would be a village, a community, a place where work and life were interwoven in ways that felt almost utopian to workers accustomed to the cramped, smoke-filled tenements of industrial cities. George Cadbury, who would become the primary visionary behind this transformation, possessed what we might describe as architectural idealism. He believed in the power of physical environment to shape human character and well-being. The design of Bourneville reflected this conviction in every detail. Rather than constructing the dense warren of factory housing that had sprung up around other industrial centres, Cadbury and his architects envisioned something different. Semi-detached houses with gardens, with proper ventilation, with windows that allowed light and air. Families would have space. Children would have room to play. There would be parks and green spaces, built into the fabric of the community, rather than existing as afterthoughts. The parallels to what Rowntree was beginning to contemplate in York were striking, though each family would develop their vision in slightly different ways, reflecting their own temperaments and the particular geography of their locations. In 1902, recognizing that his own factory in York had similarly outgrown its urban site, Seabohm Rowntree made a comparable decision. He purchased land to the south of the city, in an area called Haxby Road, and began to construct what would become his own model village, New Earswick. Where Cadbury's vision at Bourneville tended toward the picturesque, with winding roads and deliberate asymmetry, Rowntree's approach at New Earswick reflected his own more measured, almost architectural temperament. The streets were laid out with greater regularity, yet no less thoughtfully. There were still gardens for every cottage, still the same commitment to light and air, to community spaces and schools. Two manufacturers in different cities, separated by perhaps 100 miles, had arrived at nearly identical conclusions about what ought to be possible for working people. The coincidence speaks to something deeper, perhaps the way that industrial wealth, when filtered through a certain kind of conscience and a particular religious tradition, naturally tends toward paternalistic improvement, toward the belief that one might engineer a better society through thoughtful design and the provision of comfortable housing. But there was another element woven into these visions, one that was both benevolent and unmistakably controlling. The model villages were not democratic experiments. They were visions imposed from above, however well-intentioned the imposition might be. The Cadbury and Rowntree families retained ownership of the land, maintained architectural oversight, and enforced behavioral standards. Alcohol was forbidden in many of the housing areas. There were rules about the maintenance of gardens, requirements about respectability. The houses were often rented rather than sold, which meant that residency remained subject to ongoing approval. In this way, these manufacturers had created not just improved housing, but a form of social governance, a way of ensuring that their workers lived according to principles that aligned with Quaker values. One might imagine the effect on those workers, the genuine gratitude for improved conditions, for housing that protected their families from damp and disease, for gardens where their children could safely play, existing alongside a subtle but persistent awareness that they were always being observed, always subject to judgment, always dependent on the continued goodwill of their employers. The model villages then represent a peculiar historical moment, a time when industrial capitalism and religious idealism had not yet fully fractured from one another, when a manufacturer might genuinely believe that providing superior housing and working conditions was both ethically correct and good for business. And in many ways he was right. The workers at Cadbury and Rowntree were, by the standards of the time, remarkably well treated, and the factories themselves became models that would be studied and occasionally imitated around the world. Yet the model villages also reveal something about power, about the way that even enlightened power remains power, and that the desire to improve the lives of others can coexist with the desire to control them. In the comfortable cottages of Bourneville and New Earswick, this tension remained largely unspoken, submerged beneath layers of genuine care and genuine gratitude. The workers lived better than they might have elsewhere, and their employers slept well, believing themselves to be forces for good, which, in their way, they genuinely were, though history would later suggest that the relationship between capital and labor might eventually require a less paternalistic, more genuinely democratic arrangement to reach its full moral potential. For now, though, in the closing years of the Victorian era and the opening years of the 20th century, these carefully planned villages stood as testimonies to a particular vision of how capitalism might be softened, humanized, and made to serve not just profit, but something approaching the common good. In the decades that followed the First World War, the chocolate families found themselves navigating a world that had been fundamentally remade by conflict and grief. The old certainties, the steady expansion of empire, the unquestioned authority of family ownership, the rhythm of provincial life, had all become uncertain. And yet, it was precisely in this moment of flux that both Cadbury and Rowntree experienced what might be called their golden age, though the sweetness of it was complicated by the knowledge of everything that had been lost. John Cadbury's great-grandson, Edward Cadbury, had come of age during the war years, and like so many men of his generation, he carried the weight of decisions made in factories that supplied the troops. Chocolate had been sent to soldiers in trenches across Europe. It had been a comfort, yes, but it had also meant that the machinery of chocolate making was inextricably bound up with industrial-scale warfare. When peace returned, there was a strange mixture of pride and unease in that memory. The Cadbury family had done their duty, but the cost of that duty pressed upon them in ways both visible and invisible. What emerged in the 1920s and 1930s was a remarkable flowering of corporate paternalism that, while it may seem quaint or even unsettling to modern sensibilities, represented at the time a genuine attempt to square the circle of profit and conscience. The Cadbury brothers and their successors had established, back in the 1800s, a model village at Bourneville, a place where workers might live in something approaching dignity, with access to gardens and schools and medical care. This was not charity in the traditional sense, nor was it purely philanthropic. It was rooted in a Quaker conviction that the material conditions of life mattered, that work should not destroy the human being who performed it. Now, in the interwar years, that vision was being extended and deepened. The Rowntree family, operating from York in the north, was undertaking similar experiments. Joseph Rowntree Jr., who had taken the company into the 20th century with remarkable foresight, had already established a trust and pension schemes that were genuinely ahead of their time. But it was his sons and grandsons who would elaborate on these foundations with an almost utopian intensity. They built housing estates. They created works councils where employees had some voice in decisions affecting them. They invested in recreational facilities, sports grounds, cinema halls, even libraries. Was this enlightened self-interest designed to keep workers content and productive? Certainly, but was it also animated by a genuine moral conviction that business could be a vehicle for human flourishing? That seems, from the historical distance, genuinely true as well. The chocolate itself, during these years, was becoming more refined and more diverse. At Cadbury, the famous purple wrapper of dairy milk had been established just before the First World War, in 1905, and now it became an icon, a small purple rectangle that signified something unmistakably British and dependable. Rowntree's was developing its own innovations. Kit Kat, that elegant wafer in chocolate, arrived in 1935, and its very modernity, its clean lines and clever name, seemed to embody the spirit of the age. These were not simple products. They were designed with care, marketed with sophistication, and backed by research and development that was continuous and, for the time, quite advanced. It is worth pausing here to consider what was happening in the broader commercial landscape. The 1920s and 1930s saw the rise of what might be called consumer capitalism, and the chocolate companies were at the forefront of this transformation. Advertising was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Radio was a new medium, and chocolate companies learned to use it. Cinema was expanding, and chocolate was present there too. The confection that you might enjoy during a film, a small pleasure that punctuated leisure time. The chocolate bar itself, standardized and branded, became a form of modern citizenship, a democratic indulgence accessible to people across a range of social classes. And here too, the Quaker heritage of both families seemed to shape their approach in subtle ways. There was little of the pure hedonism, the naked appeal to excess, that characterized some advertising in the era. Instead, there was an emphasis on wholesomeness, on family, on modest treats that were part of a sensible life. A bar of chocolate was not presented as a gateway to abandon or luxury, but as a reasonable, even wholesome part of everyday existence. Whether this represented genuine conviction or extraordinarily skillful marketing is perhaps a false dichotomy. The two things were intertwined. The factories themselves in these years were becoming tourist destinations of a sort. Bourneville, in particular, had become known to people across Britain as a place of pilgrimage for those interested in industrial progress and social welfare. Visitors could see the workers engaged in their labor, could observe the cleanliness and order of the production lines, could understand themselves as participants in a modern, rational, and fundamentally benevolent system. This was brand building, certainly, but it was also an expression of genuine pride in what had been created. Yet underneath this narrative of progress and enlightenment, there were currents that were more troubling, if you look closely enough. The paternalism, for all its genuine benefits, was still paternalism. Workers were cared for, yes, but they were also subject to considerable oversight and moral regulation. Alcoholic beverages were discouraged. Behavior was monitored. In some sense, the price of the decent housing and the pension schemes was a degree of control over workers' lives that we would find quite uncomfortable today. The company took an interest not merely in what people did at work, but in how they lived outside it. Moreover, the very success of the chocolate companies meant that they were accumulating wealth and influence at a rapid pace, and the structures of ownership and control were becoming more complex. In the case of Rowntree, for instance, the growth of the business meant that family members were being trained, prepared, placed in positions of leadership. There was a sense in which the continuation of the enterprise and the continuation of the family dynasty were becoming one and the same thing, and the older ideals of Quaker service were gradually becoming entangled with more conventional aspirations toward prestige and power. Meanwhile, chocolate itself was becoming a genuinely global commodity. Cocoa was being sourced from multiple countries, the Caribbean, West Africa, Southeast Asia, and the supply chains that brought these raw materials to the factories in Birmingham and York involved networks of production and trade that stretched across the colonial world. The Cadbury and Rowntree families in their enlightened treatment of British workers, existed within an international system of labour and commerce that was far more brutal and exploitative. How aware were they of this contradiction? How much did they concern themselves with the conditions under which cocoa was grown and harvested? These are questions that the historical record does not always answer clearly, but they are worth holding in mind as we consider the full picture of these enterprises. The 1930s brought new challenges. Economic depression gripped the Western world, and the chocolate companies, like all businesses, faced uncertainty and the pressure of reduced demand. Both Cadbury and Rowntree responded with a kind of determined continuity. They maintained their commitment to their workers, resisting the temptation to simply cut costs and lay people off, as so many other companies did. This was partly practical, an investment in worker loyalty that might pay dividends when the economy recovered, but it was also, in at least some measure, a reflection of principle. The companies did not abandon their people when times became difficult, and perhaps most remarkably, it was in this era, in the midst of economic hardship, that both companies undertook some of their most ambitious philanthropic initiatives. Rowntree, in particular, was engaged in serious research into the nature of poverty itself, not as a moral failing, but as a structural condition that might be understood and even remedied through rational analysis and policy. This research would later inform thinking about the welfare state. The chocolate family, in other words, was not merely profiting from the public's appetite for sweets. It was also, in a somewhat eccentric but undeniably genuine way, thinking about the larger questions of social justice and economic organization that haunted the age. As the decade wore on, and the 1930s gave way to the eve of another great conflict, the chocolate companies stood at an interesting juncture. They were undeniably successful, undeniably powerful, and undeniably embedded within systems of production and profit that were complicated, sometimes troubling, and certainly not entirely consistent with the high ideals that their Quaker founders had articulated. Yet they were also, in their own way, laboratories of a different kind of capitalism, experiments in the possibility that business might be conducted with some regard for human dignity and social welfare. How those experiments would fare in the crucible of another war remained to be seen. The early decades of the 20th century were marked by a peculiar tension within both the Cadbury and Rowntree families, a tension between the very values that had built their empires and the relentless pressure of modern industrial competition. The chocolate business, you see, had evolved from a medicinal curiosity and a luxury indulgence into something far more ambitious, a mass-market commodity. And with that transformation came questions that kept the Quaker proprietors awake in their counting houses, questions about profit and principle, about growth and conscience. George Cadbury, having stepped back from the day-to-day management of his beloved factory in 1911, had not truly retired into quietude. He was a man in his 60s then, with snow-white hair and the bearing of someone who had already achieved more than most people dared imagine. Yet he remained deeply invested in the spiritual and ethical foundation of Cadbury Brothers. He spent his final years, he died in 1922, watching with a mixture of satisfaction and subtle concern as his sons and grandsons inherited not just a business, but a philosophy. And philosophy, as anyone who has attempted to live by one knows, is far more fragile than brick and mortar. The Cadbury family's expansion during this period had already pushed them beyond the boundaries of Bourneville itself. In addition to their factories and chocolate-making operations in England, they had begun to establish international partnerships and overseas production. Australia received a Cadbury operation in 1923, just a year after George's death, a testament to how thoroughly the family had embraced not merely British commerce, but a genuinely global ambition. It was as if the chocolate itself had become a vehicle for Quaker values spreading across the map, sweetening the world one bar at a time. Yet this expansion raised a question that the Cadburys had not fully grappled with in the sheltered days of their earlier growth. How do you maintain ethical standards and benevolent paternalism when your workforce has grown from hundreds to thousands, when your factories span continents, when the intimate knowledge that George himself once held, the knowing of nearly every worker's name, their circumstances, their families, becomes impossible? When paternalism scales, does it not risk becoming something merely administrative, performance rather than genuine care? The Rowntrees faced these same questions, though they had arrived at them via a somewhat different route. Joseph Rowntree, the founder's son, who had taken the reins and built the company into something magnificent before his death in 1925, had been even more philosophically inclined than George Cadbury in some ways. He had not simply created a chocolate factory, he had established, alongside it, a series of extraordinary institutions born from his belief that chocolate wealth could and should serve social reform. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, established in 1904, was one of the world's first philanthropic organizations created by an industrialist, and it was meant to survive the founder, to persist as a force for social investigation and improvement long after he was gone. Where Cadbury had built Bourneville as a model town around his factory, a place where workers might live and grow, Rowntree's philanthropy was broader in scope, more intellectually ambitious. He funded housing reforms, he supported research into poverty and its causes, he paid for studies and investigations that might improve public policy. There was something almost anxious in his generosity, as though he feared that merely providing good wages and pleasant working conditions was not enough, that conscience demanded something more, a kind of intellectual participation in solving the larger problems of society. Both men, as they aged and eventually passed into history, had created institutional legacies that outlasted their own physical presence. That is a particular kind of immortality that the industrialist can achieve, and it is one that the Quaker temperament has always found appealing, the idea that your wealth and influence might persist in doing good even after your voice has been silenced. As the 1920s deepened into the 1930s, however, the economic landscape of Britain was shifting in ways that would test these legacies severely. The Great Depression descended upon the Western world, and the chocolate industry, long considered something of a resilience business, a product that people found comfort in even during hardship, faced its own peculiar challenges. Demand for luxury items contracted as it must, and the factories that had seemed to promise permanent employment for their workers suddenly found themselves navigating periods of reduced production and, inevitably, layoffs. The Cadbury and Rowntree families were forced to confront a new reality, that benevolence, however sincere, could not wholly exempt them from the economic forces that were reshaping Britain. The paternalistic systems they had built, the worker housing, the recreational facilities, the educational programs, these were all vulnerable to the simple arithmetic of economics. One might argue, and many historians have done so, that the Quaker chocolate magnates handled this transition with more grace and responsibility than their contemporaries in other industries. They did not simply abandon their commitments, but the era of expanding benevolence was giving way to an era of economic necessity. And that transition, though subtly managed, was nonetheless real. There was a melancholy to it, perhaps, a recognition that even the most thoughtfully constructed systems of industrial welfare could not withstand the larger currents of history. Yet there was also, in the way that the Cadbury and Rowntree families responded, a kind of stubborn persistence in their values. They were determined, despite everything, to prove that you could run a large, profitable enterprise in the modern industrial world without abandoning the principles that had founded it. This determination would define their choices through the anxious 1930s and into the tumultuous years beyond, when a different kind of global catastrophe would reshape not just economics but everything else as well. The factories themselves became architectural declarations of the Quaker vision, and this is where the philosophy of John and Richard shifted from sermon to stone and steel. Where most industrial mill owners of the 19th century were content to pile their workers into cramped dormitories and tenements thick with smoke and disease, the Cadbury brothers looked across at what they had built and asked themselves a question that would have seemed almost radical in those days. What if we built something beautiful instead? In 1859, John Cadbury had established the business in Birmingham, that great throbbing heart of English manufacturing. But it was George and Richard, his sons, who would inherit not just a chocolate company but a conscience. And they carried that conscience with them when, in 1879, they made a decision that shocked their competitors. They chose to relocate their entire operation to a greenfield site on the outskirts of the city, to a place called Bourneville. The name itself was George's invention, a touch of whimsy drawn from the French word for water, bourne, and the English landscape he loved. It was to be, in his mind, neither village nor industrial complex, but something altogether different. What rose from that land over the following decades was less a factory than a small city conceived in chocolate. And here, the Quaker philosophy found its fullest expression. The factory buildings were designed not to intimidate or overwhelm, but to breathe. They had wide windows to flood the workrooms with natural light, a revolutionary concept when most mills kept their workers in perpetual dusk. The air was filtered through ventilation systems that would seem luxurious even by modern standards. Break rooms were furnished with comfortable seating, and there were spaces designated simply for rest, for quiet, for the human spirit to unfold during the working day. Around this industrial heart, George and Richard began something even more extraordinary. They constructed houses for their workers, not the usual dark back-to-back cottages that characterized working-class housing, but genuine cottages with gardens, with space, with individuality. Each home had its own small plot of land where families could grow vegetables or flowers. There were parks and green spaces woven throughout Bourneville, and swimming pools and reading rooms. Schools were built before education was even compulsory. There was a hospital. The brothers were, in essence, attempting to solve the worker question not through ideology, but through design, through the simple proposition that if you treat people well, provide them with dignity and space and light, they will flourish. The workers themselves were bewildered at first, then deeply moved. Many had come from the squalid industrial quarters of Birmingham, where children played in streets ankle-deep in filth, and mothers worked 16-hour days with no promise of rest. Suddenly, they were being offered something that felt almost like grace. Wages were higher than the industry standard. Working hours were regulated and humane. There were schemes for profit sharing, pension plans decades before such things became commonplace. Women, who made up the majority of the workforce in chocolate production, were treated with particular consideration. They received equal pay for equal work at a time when such an idea was considered economically nonsensical. But perhaps most profoundly, the Quaker vision extended to the moral character of the place itself. There was an almost puritanical insistence that Bourneville remain free from certain kinds of establishments. No public houses would be licensed in the village, no pubs, no temptation toward drink and the degradation the founders believed it brought. This might seem paternalistic now, and indeed it was, but it was paternalism of a particular kind, born not from contempt for workers, but from genuine belief in their potential for betterment. If the factories of Birmingham ground people down into poverty and alcoholism, what if a factory could lift them up instead? It was a vision that could not have emerged from anything other than Quaker conviction. The Society of Friends has, throughout its history, held a peculiar relationship to wealth. Quakers believe firmly that making money is not sinful. Indeed, the ethic of hard work and honest dealing is fundamental to their faith, but they believe with equal firmness that wealth imposes obligations. One does not accumulate riches for their own sake. One accumulates them as a stewardship, as a trust held temporarily in one's hands to be deployed for the greater good. The very word stewardship carries the weight of responsibility. You are not the owner of your fortune, you are its custodian. And so Bournville became a kind of visible sermon, a place where this principle was etched into the landscape. It announced to the world that wealth need not produce exploitation, that business need not be ugly, that industry could be reconciled with human dignity. The workers responded by producing chocolate of extraordinary quality and consistency. There was, in some strange way, a reciprocal relationship. Care given freely seems to generate excellence in return, as if the human spirit, when treated with respect, simply performs better. The Rowntree family, meanwhile, was pursuing a parallel path in York, a city in the north that would become their domain in much the same way Birmingham was Cadbury's. Henry Rowntree had founded the business in 1862, but it was his sons, particularly Joseph, who would shape it according to Quaker principles. Joseph Rowntree was, in many ways, even more systematically committed to social reform than the Cadbury brothers. Where they built Bournville intuitively, in response to their moral convictions, Joseph approached the question almost scientifically. He became obsessed with understanding poverty itself. What caused it? How could it be prevented? He commissioned research. He studied the living conditions of working families with the meticulous care of a scholar. And from this study emerged a revolutionary proposal. The factory worker in York would receive a wage calculated not on the basis of what the market would bear, or what tradition dictated, but on the basis of what a family actually needed to live with dignity. This was, in essence, the first minimum wage argument, though it would not be framed in such terms for many decades. Joseph went further still. He created what he called industrial guilds, cooperative structures within the factory where workers had a genuine voice in decision-making. He established pension schemes and sick funds. He built beautiful housing, the new Earswick estate, designed by the progressive urban planner Barry Parker, where every cottage received sunlight and air and was surrounded by green. He seemed to believe, with an almost utopian fervor, that business could be an instrument of redemption, that the profit motive could be harnessed towards social good. Yet there was always an interesting tension in these enterprises, a question that seemed to hover unspoken over Bournville and New Earswick alike. Could paternalism, however benevolent, ever truly be liberating? The Cadbury and Rowntree families were offering their workers unprecedented security and dignity, yes, but they were also controlling the shape of their lives, prescribing how they should live, what they should believe, what they should avoid. There was no drinking in Bournville because the owners believed drinking was wrong. There were no pubs because George Cadbury had decided they were corrupting. The workers had better lives than their counterparts in Manchester or Sheffield, certainly, but they also lived within a moral framework that had been constructed for them, not by them. This paradox would become more visible as time passed, as the 20th century arrived with its democratizing impulses and challenges to all forms of authority. But for now, in the late 1800s, as Bournville grew and New Earswick took shape, they seemed like nothing short of miraculous. Photographs of the period show workers in neat dress, factories filled with light, gardens flourishing around cottages, children in schools. It is the image of industrial capitalism transformed, made humane, made moral. It is what a society built on Christian principles might look like, with chocolate as its medium and Quaker conviction as its soul. The Cadbury family's conscience, however, did not end at the factory gates. By the early 20th century, George and Richard Cadbury had begun to turn their attention towards something that troubled them deeply, the source of their raw material itself. Cocoa, the humble bean that had transformed their fortunes, was being grown thousands of miles away in West Africa, and what they were learning about the conditions under which it was harvested began to weigh upon their Quaker souls in ways that profits alone could never lighten. You see, around the turn of the century, investigations into Portuguese cocoa plantations in the islands of São Tomé and Príncipe revealed something that should have shocked Victorian England into action, yet somehow moved slowly through the public consciousness like honey through cold air. The cocoa was being produced through a system that bore troubling resemblances to slavery itself. Workers, many of them forcibly recruited from mainland Africa, labored under conditions of such severity that the distinction between bondage and contract became almost meaningless. The death rates were staggering. The exploitation was systematic. For the Cadbury brothers, this discovery posed an acute moral problem. They were men of principle, shaped by Quaker teachings that emphasized the dignity of labor and the interconnectedness of all human beings. Yet their entire enterprise depended upon this cocoa, the chocolate that had built their fortune, that had allowed them to create Bournville and to implement their progressive labor practices at home, was being purchased with the suffering of others far away. How does one reconcile such a contradiction? The question must have kept them awake in the evenings, despite the comfort of their successful lives. George and Richard made a decision that would define their legacy in profound ways. They determined that Cadbury would not simply accept the system as it existed. Instead, they began what we might now recognize as an early form of supply chain activism. They launched investigations of their own into the cocoa plantations. They wrote letters. They used their influence as prominent businessmen to bring pressure upon the Portuguese government and upon other chocolate manufacturers. They advocated, loudly and persistently, for reform. But here is where the story becomes more complicated, as most human stories do when examined closely. The Cadbury brothers did not immediately stop purchasing cocoa from these plantations, even as they condemned the practices there. They continued to buy, to profit, to benefit from the very system they were publicly criticizing. Some historians suggest they were caught between their principles and their commercial interests. Others argue that they believed engagement and pressure from within the market would create more change than total withdrawal would have accomplished. Perhaps both things were true. Perhaps the truth is that even the most conscientious people are sometimes entangled in systems larger than their individual choices can untangle. What is certain is that their activism did have effects. Cadbury's public stance on the cocoa question influenced other manufacturers. It contributed to growing awareness in Britain about the human costs of empire and expansion. It opened conversations that had previously been conducted in whispers and private correspondence. The Cadbury name became associated not just with chocolate, but with the uncomfortable recognition that sweetness can have bitter origins and that commerce carries moral weight. This moral wrestling extended into other aspects of their business philosophy as well. George Cadbury became increasingly involved in housing reform and urban development, not merely at Bournville, but as a public advocate for better living conditions across Britain. He believed that workers deserved not just fair wages, but dignified homes, open spaces, gardens where they could grow food, neighborhoods designed with health and community in mind. Bournville was his laboratory, but his vision extended far beyond his factory gates. Richard, meanwhile, channeled his energies into education and social improvement in different ways. Both brothers were generous philanthropists, though they gave with intention and oversight rather than with the distant charity of wealthy people who simply write checks and move on. They wanted to understand the problems they were addressing. They wanted to see results. They wanted, in the deepest sense, to use their wealth as a tool for genuine transformation rather than mere conscience salving. It is worth pausing here to consider what this meant for the broader chocolate industry and for Victorian and Edwardian society more generally. The Cadbury brothers were part of a particular moment in history when industrial wealth, Quaker principle, and growing social consciousness were beginning to intersect in interesting ways. They were not unique in their concern for workers or their philanthropic impulses, but they were unusually positioned to act on these concerns while still building massive commercial enterprises. They proved, or at least suggested, that it was possible to be both profitable and principled, though the two were always in tension. Meanwhile, across the industrial landscape of Britain, other chocolate makers were watching, competing, innovating in their own ways. The Rowntree family, operating from their base in York, had been building their own empire with a similar blend of commercial acumen and social conscience, though the particulars of their story and their choices would diverge in interesting ways from the Cadbury path. Where Cadbury had created a model industrial village, Rowntree would focus more intently on the welfare systems within the factory itself and on pioneering research into the conditions that allowed workers to thrive. Both approaches reflected Quaker values, yet each family expressed those values through different channels and choices. The early decades of the 20th century saw both dynasties at the height of their powers. Cadbury and Rowntree were household names across Britain and the British Empire. The products bearing their names were symbols of British manufacturing prowess, of innovation, of quality. Chocolate, once a luxury item known only to the wealthy, had become a pleasure accessible to working people. A factory worker in Manchester could afford to buy a bar of chocolate for a few pennies. This democratization of a previously elite pleasure was itself a kind of revolution, quiet and gentle, moving through society one satisfied customer at a time. In the end, what remains most striking about the Cadbury and Rowntree dynasties is not the size of their factories or the reach of their brands across the globe, but rather the strange alchemy that allowed deeply held principles to coexist for nearly 2 centuries with the relentless machinery of commerce. Here were families who believed that labor was sacred, that workers deserved dignity and rest and gardens of their own, and who looked upon child labor and exploitation not as inevitable costs of business, but as violations of conscience. Yet they also built empires. They accumulated wealth. They created systems of production that were, by the measures of their time, ruthlessly efficient. Perhaps this contradiction is less contradictory than it first appears. Perhaps what made Cadbury and Rowntree so distinctive was not that they transcended the pressures of industrial capitalism, but that they refused to surrender entirely to them. They operated within the system, yes, but with a kind of purposeful resistance. They asked, repeatedly, what a factory could be if it were built around human welfare rather than purely around profit, and they paid a price for asking that question, and they reaped rewards. The two things happened together. The villages they created, Bourneville and York, still exist today, though transformed by time and by the inevitable forces of modern development. If you walk through them now, you will find yourself in places that feel settled, that feel made for living, rather than merely for working. The streets are wide, there are parks, schools still stand. The Quaker conviction that beauty matters, that our surroundings shape who we become, has left an imprint on the landscape that outlasts the families themselves. Long after the Cadburys and Rowntrees surrendered control of their companies, these villages remain as evidence of a particular vision. And what became of the companies? They were absorbed, inevitably, into larger structures. Rowntree fell to Nestlé in 1969, a Swiss corporation with different priorities and different values. Cadbury lasted longer under family stewardship, but was eventually claimed by Kraft Foods in 2010, an American conglomerate shaped by a wholly different philosophy. The transition was neither clean nor painless. Workers worried, communities held their breath. The question that hung in the air was always the same. What happens when a business built on conscience is inherited by a business built on efficiency alone? When the moral foundation is removed, does the structure still stand? The answer, perhaps, is more nuanced than simple tragedy or simple progress. Nestlé and Kraft have maintained, in most cases, the factories themselves. They have continued to employ thousands. They have preserved, more or less, the architectural monuments. Yet something intangible has shifted. The paternalism may have softened, but it has also retreated. The sense that a company exists first to serve its workers, and through that service to make something of value, has been replaced by a different logic: growth, efficiency, margin, return. These are not evil things. They are the language by which modern industry speaks. But they are a different language from the one Cadbury and Rowntree used, even in their most commercially successful moments. What, then, is the ultimate legacy of these two dynasties? It is not that they solved the problem of capitalism, because they did not. It is not that they found a way to make a business that was purely good, because no such thing exists. The temptations were always there, the contradictions always present. But they left behind a kind of proof of concept. They showed that it was possible, or at least that it had been possible, to ask different questions, to prioritize different things, to believe that how you treat people matters more than how much profit you extract. In a world increasingly concerned with corporate responsibility and ethical business practices, in an age where consumers scrutinize supply chains and expect companies to account for their impact on the world, the Cadbury and Rowntree experiment reads almost like a prophecy. These families understood, more than a century before it became fashionable to say so, that business has a shape, a character, an influence on the world that extends far beyond quarterly earnings. They understood that a factory is a moral space, that workers are people, that a company town, for better or worse, shapes the life of everyone in it. Whether they lived up fully to their own ideals is something historians will always debate, and indeed it is complicated. The evidence is mixed. They were capitalists who spoke the language of conscience. They were masters of industry who believed in restraint. They were wealthy men who questioned the morality of wealth. These tensions never fully resolve. But consider this quiet thought as you drift toward sleep. Somewhere in the industrial heartland of England, in cities that were transformed by chocolate, by cocoa, by the machinery of commerce shaped by something approaching conscience, there are still streets named Cadbury and Rowntree. There are still parks that were planted because someone believed workers deserved beauty. There are still schools and libraries built by families who believed that success meant something more than money. And in a world that continues to grapple with questions about how to build businesses that are both profitable and principled, these traces of an older vision persist, quiet and unassuming, suggesting that another way, even if never perfect, might yet be possible. The story of chocolate, in the end, is the story of power. The power to create, to employ, to influence, to shape communities and lives and landscapes. And the story of Cadbury and Rowntree is the story of what happened when people with that power asked themselves hard questions about how to use it. Not whether they always asked them perfectly, not whether they always answered correctly, but that they asked at all, that they tried, that for a time, in two small English cities, chocolate was not merely a commodity, but a lens through which someone looked at the world and saw not just opportunity, but responsibility. And perhaps that is enough to hold on to, as the night deepens around you, and your thoughts begin to soften and slow, that somewhere, once, people chose to build something, not perfect, never perfect, but made with more care for human dignity, than the systems surrounding them demanded, and that those choices, preserved in brick and in memory and in the living breath of communities that continue across generations to exist, that those choices still matter, that they still speak, that they still suggest to anyone listening quietly in the dark that we too might be asked to choose what kind of legacy we leave, and that the answer we give, one small decision at a time, matters more than we might have imagined.